Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Today we're diving into one of the most mysterious, and at the same time, intriguing, creatures in the wizarding world, the Boggart. This shapeshifter turns into a person's greatest fear, and that's precisely what makes it so deeply terrifying. Boggarts are only briefly mentioned in the books, which makes it even more exciting to explore them further. In this episode, I'll share what fears Boggarts revealed in the main characters and offer my thoughts on what form they might have taken for others whose Boggarts were never shown. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Neville Longbottom, Professor Snape in Gran's clothes. At first glance it's funny, but beneath the surface lies the essence of Neville's school-related trauma. His Boggart took the shape of Professor Severus Snape, the man who emotionally crushed him for years during potions class. To defeat it, Neville imagined Snape wearing his grandmother's clothes. A ridiculous hat and handbag. Yes, it's comical, but it's also a sign of deep psychological pain. Some fans even believe that Snape's cruelty stemmed from the prophecy that if Voldemort had chosen a different baby, Neville might have been the chosen one. Number 2. Hermione Granger, Professor McGonagall announcing her failure. That's right, Hermione's greatest fear was failing her exams. Her Boggart took the form of the strict Professor McGonagall, telling her she had failed everything. But this isn't just school anxiety. Hermione is Muggle-born. She always felt the need to prove that she deserved her place in the magical world. Failing exams wasn't just about bad grades. It was about being rejected. That's why, in the Philosopher's Stone, the idea of expulsion from Hogwarts was her worst nightmare. Number 3. Ron Weasley, a giant spider. Spiders have haunted Ron since childhood, ever since Fred turned his teddy bear into a spider as a prank. That memory stuck with him so deeply that his Boggart later turned into a massive 8-legged monster. Unlike the others, Ron's fear isn't philosophical. It's a straightforward phobia, but what matters is how he handles it. Despite his terror, Ron still followed Harry into the forest to meet Aragog, once again proving his courage and true Gryffindor heart. Number 4. Remus Lupin, the Full Moon. Students saw Professor Lupin's fear firsthand when he stepped in front of the Boggart himself. It instantly transformed into the full moon. A symbol of the nights, he turned into a werewolf. This fear isn't just physical. It represents shame, guilt, and fear of harming others. Bitten as a child, Lupin lived his entire life with a monster inside, one he never asked for. He feared not just being discovered, but also the moment he might lose control and hurt someone he cared about. Number 5. Albus Dumbledore, Fallen Ariana. Though Dumbledore never encounters a Boggart in the books, J.K. Rowling revealed in an interview that if he had, it would have taken the form of his dead sister, Ariana. During a tragic duel between Albus, his brother Aberforth, and the young Gellert Grindelwald, Ariana was accidentally hit by a curse. Dumbledore was haunted by guilt ever since. That guilt led him to wear Marvolo Gaunt's ring, a Horcrux containing the Resurrection Stone, in hopes of seeing her again. That choice ultimately cost him his life. Number 6. Voldemort, his own lifeless body. Tom Riddle, Lord Voldemort, never encountered a Boggart in the books, but Rowling admitted if he had, it would have turned into his own dead body. This reflects his obsession with immortality. Voldemort created 7 Horcruxes because he feared death more than anything. His fear wasn't simply about the end of life. It was about vanishing as a person, losing power and being forgotten. That's why he fought so desperately for every chance to continue existing. Number 7. Harry Potter, a Dementor, perhaps the most fascinating Boggart. During Professor Lupin's class, Harry came face to face with a Dementor, not Voldemort as the teacher expected. Why? Because Dementors don't just scare you, they drain all hope, warmth, and light. Harry wasn't afraid of a creature, but of the feeling of utter despair and helplessness they brought. He feared the darkness within. And that's what makes him one of the strongest characters. He looked fear in the eye and didn't let it rule him. Number 8. Draco Malfoy, public humiliation. If a boggart had appeared before Draco Malfoy, it would not have turned into a dark creature or a monster. It would have become Draco himself, his robes torn, his hair a mess, standing in the middle of the Great Hall. Everyone is laughing. Harry's eyes burn with triumph. Hermione whispers something to Ron, who grins. Even Pansy Parkinson covers her mouth to hide a giggle. Draco's wand is broken. His voice won't come. That silence, that helplessness, is the nightmare. The pureblood prince, stripped of dignity, exposed as weak. Draco was raised to believe in pride, in control. The Malfoy name was a shield, but in Half-Blood Prince he begins to crack. "I have to do this," he tells Dumbledore, trembling, wand shaking. "He'll kill me." That moment is the truth behind his boggart. Not fear of pain, but fear of failure, of being small, humiliated, powerless. It's not Potter he hates the most. It's the idea that Potter might be stronger, that others might see it and laugh. Number 9, Sirius Black, Azkaban, and Dementors. When Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban, he didn't run from walls. He ran from silence, from the icy grip of Dementors swirling around him, pulling memories apart. If a boggart had stepped in front of him, it would have shown a narrow stone cell, no light, just cold. The sound of his own breathing drowned by the soft, horrible sucking of Dementors. "You think the dead we loved ever truly leave us?" Dumbledore once said. Sirius lived that truth. But in Azkaban, even memory was poison. Remus, James, Lily, all blurred by the fog of despair. Sirius feared that place not for what it did to his body, but for what it did to his soul. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, he tells Harry, "I did my waiting, 12 years of it, in Azkaban." That cry wasn't rage, it was agony. The fear of being locked away again, unseen and unheard, was stronger than death. That's why he leapt into battle at the Ministry. That's why he told Harry to live free, to trust himself. Sirius didn't fight to be a hero. He fought to never be a prisoner again. Number 10, Ginny Weasley, Tom Riddle with the diary. Ginny Weasley would never forget the diary. In Chamber of Secrets, she writes into its blank pages, not knowing she's feeding a memory. Tom Riddle appears slowly, gently, whispering understanding, then control, then darkness. If a boggart stood before her, it would become him, young, handsome, cold, clutching the black diary as if offering it again. "Shall we begin, Ginny?" he might say, smiling. Behind him, shadows of the basilisk, a classroom dripping in silence, her own hands stained with the ink of secrets she never meant to tell. This wasn't just fear of Voldemort, it was fear of herself, of how easily she'd been pulled into the dark. In Half-Blood Prince, she refuses to let Harry blame himself for using the prince's book. She speaks from experience. "You don't know what you're doing when it's happening," she says. That's her boggart, guilt that never fades. Not the monster, but the moment she let it in. The feeling of being used, controlled, turned against the people she loved. The fear that deep down it could happen again. Number 12, Bellatrix Lestrange. Powerlessness and captivity. If a boggart had faced Bellatrix Lestrange, it wouldn't have shown her a corpse or a monster. It would have shown her bound in chains, wandless, eyes dim, kneeling before faceless figures who looked at her with pity. That image, powerless, voiceless, was her deepest terror. Bellatrix craved domination, not for her own pleasure, but because it proved her worth to Lord Voldemort. In The Half-Blood Prince, she hisses, "The Dark Lord does not share power." And she knew that. Her entire life was spent proving she deserved a piece of it. She wasn't afraid of death. She laughed in the Department of Mysteries when Sirius fell through the veil. She challenged Molly Weasley with a mad grin even as the walls of Hogwarts burned. But she feared being broken, being forgotten, stripped of everything that made her dangerous. Her madness was a mask and her cruelty a weapon, because weakness would mean she was just another Black family daughter, lost in her cousin's shadow. Her boggart showed her without rage, without fire, just silence, just chains. Bellatrix believed that loyalty gave her value. Without Voldemort she was nothing. That's why she screamed his name, in the Battle of Hogwarts. That's why she carved it into her victims. In Deathly Hallows, when he told her she was his most faithful, her eyes lit up like a child's. But loyalty built on fear is brittle. The Boggart revealed the hollow truth behind her fanaticism, that beneath the fury lived a desperate voice whispering, "Don't cast me aside." Number 13, Minerva McGonagall, dead students under her care. When Professor McGonagall walked through the halls of Hogwarts, her presence commanded respect, sharp-eyed, iron-spined. Yet beneath her stern gaze lived a heart that carried more weight than most students ever realized. If a Boggart had risen before her, it might not have taken the form of Voldemort or a deadly spell. It would have become rows of lifeless students, Seamus, Lavender, Colin Creevey, laid out cold on the floor of the great hall. Their young faces still, their wands fallen. Not because she hated them, but because she loved them, and believed she had failed them. McGonagall wasn't just a teacher, she was a protector. When Harry brought news of Voldemort's return, she stood with him. In Deathly Hallows, when Snape fled the castle, McGonagall raised the statues of Hogwarts to fight. "Do your duty to our school," she cried, voice trembling not with fear, but urgency. She didn't fight for power, she fought for her students, for every child who walked through those doors with wide eyes and trembling hands. Her fear wasn't losing a battle, it was losing them. She saw them as her own. When Fred Weasley died in the final battle, something in her seemed to break, even if we never saw it. When Colin was found with his camera still in hand, her heart surely shattered in silence. Because behind every lecture, every rule, was a woman trying to keep young people safe in a world that kept turning darker. Her Boggart was not an abstract fear. It had names, faces, laughs she remembered echoing through the corridors. To fail them would mean breaking the oath she made when she first became deputy headmistress. The Boggart reminded her of every moment she sent a student into danger, every time she hoped they would return through the doors unharmed. Her nightmare was not her own death, but theirs. A silent hall, too many empty chairs, and the unbearable truth that her strength hadn't been enough. Number 14, Luna Lovegood, complete loneliness and rejection. When Luna Lovegood faced the world, she often seemed untouchable, dreamy, calm, lost in her own thoughts. Students at Hogwarts laughed behind her back. They called her Loony Lovegood. She wore radish earrings and read The Quibbler upside down. But Luna wasn't just strange, she was lonely. If a Boggart had stepped before her, it might not have turned into a monster. It might have become a small, cold room, no voices, no friends, no father, just silence, the fear of being completely forgotten. Luna's mother died when she was 9. It happened fast, an experiment gone wrong. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, she tells Harry it was rather horrible. Her voice doesn't shake, but in that moment, Harry sees her pain. Luna's bond with her father, Xenophilius, became her lifeline. Without him, without her handful of true friends, Neville, Ginny, Harry, Luna would drift into that silent room. The Boggart would take away every voice that ever truly saw her. It wouldn't kill her, it would erase her. During Dumbledore's army meetings, Luna never tried to be the loudest. She listened, she smiled, she believed. In Deathly Hallows, when Harry returns to Hogwarts, he sees a mural Luna painted in her bedroom. It shows the faces of her friends, Harry, Ron, Hermione, Neville, Ginny. The word friends connects them with golden threads. It's not just art, it's her hope, her prayer not to be alone, not to be forgotten once the battle is over and the war is history. The Boggart shows the heart's secret wound. For Luna, it wasn't fear of danger or ridicule. She had endured both. Her fear was deeper. It was waking up one day to find the world gone quiet, to find herself missing from the minds of those she loved. To be strange and, this time, completely alone. That empty room. That was the nightmare. Not because it was cold, but because no one came looking. Number 15, Horace Slughorn, Voldemort learning about the Horcruxes. In the quiet chambers of the Slug Club, surrounded by velvet chairs and the flickering glow of enchanted lanterns, sat a man who understood the power of perception better than most. Horace Slughorn, with his portly frame and polished moustache, was not merely a potions master, he was a curator of influence, a collector of brilliance. His memories shimmered with encounters with famous names, Barnabas Cuff, Gwenog Jones, even Lily Evans. But nestled in those memories, like a shard of glass in soft cake, was a moment he tried to forget, a moment that, if laid bare, would shatter the delicate image he had spent a lifetime cultivating. It is often said that a boggart reveals what a person fears most. For Slughorn, it would not be a monster or a corpse. No, his boggart would take the form of a nightmare far more subtle and excruciating. A scene, Voldemort standing tall, cold and triumphant, with the shadow of death lingering behind him, Dumbledore, solemn and betrayed, his blue eyes no longer twinkling, and dozens of young faces, Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, Draco Malfoy, all staring in silence. In this haunting tableau they have all just heard a recording, perhaps a shimmering pensive vision, of Slughorn himself, long ago, speaking in a voice coated with honey and pride. Horcruxes. Fascinating, really, the idea of splitting one's soul. In that instant, the mask would fall. The genial professor, who always seemed to be on the periphery of danger, would be exposed as the man who gave Tom Riddle the final piece of the puzzle, the man who made Voldemort possible, not by intention, not by malice, but by vanity. He had not meant to help, that much was certain. The Slughorn who spoke to the teenage Riddle that evening had been trying to impress, to win the admiration of a student who was both gifted and terrifyingly charming. Tom had a way of making others feel like the centre of the universe, if only for a moment. And Slughorn, ever the connoisseur of promise, couldn't resist basking in that gaze. "Very few know of Horcruxes," he had said, in that memory he had later altered. "Most wizards shy away from such dark magic." He dressed it up later, plucked out the ugly parts, reshaped the conversation, as if editing a portrait that was too honest. He knew the truth, and Albus Dumbledore knew it too, but he could not bear the judgment of others. He feared it more than he feared the Dark Lord himself. For what is worse than death, in Horace's mind, it was disgrace. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, J.K. Rowling writes, "You are ashamed of what you said to him all those years ago, Professor Slughorn. You'd like me to believe it didn't happen." These words were not a condemnation. They were an invitation to redemption. But for Slughorn they felt like the cold hand of truth on the nape of his neck. Throughout his career, Slughorn had arranged his life like a dinner party. He chose the guests, determined the seating, directed the conversation. He kept dangerous elements at arm's length, ensuring that his world remained comfortable, respectable. He had perfected the art of selective memory and curated reputation. But the truth is not a courteous guest. It barges in uninvited and speaks too loudly. That is why his boggart would never roar or gnash its teeth. It would simply play back that memory over and over in front of the people whose respect he valued most. Albus Dumbledore's voice would be quiet, but his silence would be louder. Voldemort's sneer would not need words, and the students' faces would be the most painful of all, young, innocent, looking at him not with fear or anger, but with disappointment. Slughorn knew about damage done by whispers. He knew how quickly a story could travel, how easily a man could be reduced to one act. He told Tom Riddle about Horcruxes, they'd say. He was the one who helped create Voldemort. Never mind that he had run from the war, had faked his own disappearance, had lived in fear for decades, or perhaps especially because of that. Cowardice does not inspire forgiveness. The irony of his fear was that Slughorn had done what he always tried to avoid. He had meddled. His entire philosophy revolved around staying adjacent to power, never inside its core. He liked talent, he nurtured it, but he never wanted the weight of it. He wanted to be remembered for shaping great minds, not unleashing a monster. Yet he could not pretend he hadn't noticed the hunger in Riddle's eyes, the clinical way he asked about murder, the way his questions were veiled in flattery and false innocence. Slughorn had seen it, but he'd refused to acknowledge it. It was easier to sip mead and laugh at anecdotes than to ask the hard questions. When Harry retrieved the unaltered memory, he saw a different man than the one sitting in the armchair at Hogwarts. Younger, certainly, but already skilled in the dance of deflection. His tone was casual, almost lazy. But the look in his eyes when Riddle asked the fateful question was not ignorance, it was complicity. The moment stretched long and thin, and then it snapped, he answered. Yes, I believe if one splits the soul into 7 parts, well, it's a rather powerful number. The boggart, that cruel mirror of the soul, would freeze this moment. It would make him relive it endlessly. No Avada Kedavra, no Cruciatus Curse, just the slow erosion of his image in the minds of those he respected. It would be his personal Dementor, feeding not on joy, but on reputation. Number 16, Molly Weasley, Dead Children and Husband. Of all the scenes in the Harry Potter series that peel back the curtain to reveal the emotional weight carried by its characters, few are as quietly devastating as the moment Molly Weasley stands alone in 12 Grimmauld Place, battling a boggart that takes on the forms of her dead children. It is not a grand, action-packed moment. There is no wand duel, no roaring villain, no spell that changes the world. Instead, there is a mother, trembling, undone by the darkest corners of her love. That is precisely what makes it so unforgettable. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Harry discovers Molly in a room alone, attempting to drive out a boggart that has taken residence in a chest of drawers. He expects the boggart to turn into something ridiculous, perhaps a giant spider or a severed hand, something he might find amusing or grotesque. What he sees instead is Fred Weasley lying on the floor, eyes vacant, unmoving. Then, without warning, Fred's body shifts into Bill's, then Ron's, then Ginny's, one by one, her children dead. And finally, Arthur, her husband. This is not fear of spiders or heights. This is not a nightmare of failure or public humiliation. Molly's boggart is her deepest, rawest terror, the loss of those she has given her life to protect. The spectre of war has come back into her life, and it's no longer a memory of a past battle. It's an ever-present shadow creeping into her home, threatening to devour everything she holds sacred. Her reaction is not just a mother's fear, it is the grief of someone who has already lived through too much. Molly Weasley, often seen as the warm, bustling matriarch with a wand in one hand and a meat pie in the other, is not simply a homemaker or comic relief. She is a survivor. She lived through the First Wizarding War. She lost friends. Perhaps she already came close to losing family. She married Arthur and had 7 children, not because the world was safe, but because she believed in love anyway. And now, with Voldemort's return, that love is threatened in the cruelest way possible. J.K. Rowling offers no commentary during that scene. She doesn't need to. The power is in what is shown. Harry, who has already seen more than most boys his age, is disturbed by what he witnesses. He feels the weight of Molly's fear. He understands, perhaps for the first time, that adults can be fragile, that even the strongest people can crumble when confronted with what they fear most. The boggart, as described in The Prisoner of Azkaban, is a shape-shifter that becomes whatever frightens its observer the most. For Lupin, it's a full moon. For Neville, it's Severus Snape. For Molly, it is the lifeless bodies of her children. This detail alone sets her apart. Her fear is not about herself, it's about others. There's no personal horror, no selfish dread. Her worst nightmare is not dying, but being left behind to bury the people she loves. Fred and George, Ron, Percy, Bill, Charlie and Ginny, each one of her children, distinct, mischievous, stubborn, brilliant, flawed and loved. When she sees them fall one after another, she is not just confronting a hallucination. She is reliving every fear that has clawed at her since they were born. She knows what the Order is fighting. She knows who Voldemort is, and she knows that her family is on the front lines. Her boggart tells a deeper truth. She has already begun to mourn them. There is a subtle heroism in Molly Weasley that often goes unnoticed. It's not the kind you see on posters or in Daily Prophet headlines. She doesn't lead battles or uncover prophecies. She bakes, she knits, she hugs, but beneath that surface lies steel. She sends her children back to school knowing they might never return. She supports Arthur in his dangerous work at the ministry. She joins the Order without hesitation, standing against the greatest evil of their age. And when the moment comes, when Bellatrix Lestrange threatens her daughter, Molly doesn't hesitate. Her scream, "Not my daughter, you bitch," is not just anger. It's 20 years of fear and love and fire erupting at once. But before that climactic duel in the Battle of Hogwarts, there was this quieter moment in Grimmauld Place. There was a room full of shadows. There was a mother and a boggart. And there was the unbearable silence of a house that knew death too well. This scene is a mirror for something deeper. The trauma that never left Molly after the First Wizarding War. She may not speak about it, but she wears it every day. It's stitched into the jumpers she knits, baked into the meals she cooks. Every time she sends one of her children out the door, she braces for the worst. The boggart doesn't invent her fear, it simply reveals it. Harry, too, is shaped by loss. His parents died before he could remember them, and death has been a constant companion. But watching Molly fall apart in that room, he sees what it means to fear loss before it happens. He has longed for family. Molly has it, and her terror is losing it all. This contrast deepens Harry's understanding of love. It's not just about having people, it's about holding them in a world where nothing is safe. What makes Molly's boggart even more tragic is the cruel realism of it. In wartime, especially in a war where teenagers are forced to become soldiers, her fear is not irrational. It is entirely justified. We later learn that she will, in fact, lose one of her children. Fred's death in the final battle tears a hole in her world that can never be mended. The boggart was not lying. It was not an illusion. It was prophecy disguised as fear. Number 17, Peter Pettigrew being exposed by his friends. Peter Pettigrew was never the bravest among his friends. In the shadows of James Potter's charisma, Sirius Black's reckless brilliance, and Remus Lupin's quiet strength, Peter was the tag-along, the boy who laughed too loudly, agreed too quickly, and vanished when the room grew cold. But beneath that meek exterior lived a fear so deep it shaped his very soul. If ever confronted by a boggart, one might expect the creature to take the form of Voldemort, or perhaps death itself. Yet for Peter, the true horror was far more personal. His boggart would be James, Sirius, and Remus standing before him, not dead, not triumphant, but furious and disappointed, not avenging angels, but ghosts of trust betrayed. Imagine the boggart shifting and twisting, finally solidifying into three familiar silhouettes. James with his wild hair and confident stance, Sirius with eyes like storm clouds, fists clenched, Remus calm but shaking with the weight of sorrow. These weren't monsters with claws. They were friends he'd betrayed, men whose deaths and pain he'd caused. And for Peter, the sight of them, not physically imposing, but emotionally crushing, would be the ultimate terror. This is the punishment he feared more than death: exposure. Pettigrew chose his path not out of ambition, but fear. He was not lured by promises of glory. He was dragged by the terror of being caught between two worlds. On one side were the marauders, defiant and loyal. On the other, Voldemort, ruthless and rising. Peter, ever the coward, could not imagine surviving on principle alone. He did not defect because he believed. He betrayed because he could not bear to stand alone. When pressed, Peter folded. When hunted, he ran. When cornered, he submitted. This pattern followed him through every chapter of his life. When the Potters went into hiding, they chose a secret keeper. Sirius was the obvious choice, brave, unshakable Sirius. But Sirius, suspecting he was the predictable pick, suggested Peter instead, thinking no one would consider him important enough to target. "I convinced Lily and James to use you as secret keeper instead of me. I thought it was the perfect plan," Sirius said bitterly in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. It was a fatal miscalculation. Peter was no vault. He was a crack in the foundation, already leaking secrets in the dark. That betrayal was not swift. It built slowly, like poison in the veins. Peter watched the world shift and saw Voldemort gain power. He believed the Dark Lord would win. He wagered his soul on that outcome. And in doing so he signed his friends' death warrants. Lily with her kindness and strength, James who had once saved his life. Their son Harry left orphaned because Peter whispered a location in the dead of night. For years he lived as a rat, scuttling through the halls of Hogwarts, hiding in plain sight as Scabbers. It was an act of cowardice, but also of genius. He knew that the longer he remained in the wizarding world, the greater the risk of exposure. Disguised as a pet, he became part of the Weasley family. He watched the rise and fall of children, the passage of time, all the while praying no one would recognize the treachery behind his beady eyes. But rats cannot keep secrets forever. When Sirius escaped from Azkaban and hunted Peter down, the truth began to surface. Remus, ever the rational one, wanted proof. Sirius wanted justice. But even then, Peter's instinct was to plead, not to explain. He was taking over everywhere, Peter sputtered when finally revealed. What was there to be gained by refusing him? Prisoner of Azkaban. These were not the words of a man seeking redemption. They were the whimpers of one who believed survival justified betrayal. Peter's boggart, if encountered in his school years, might not have yet taken the form of the marauders. Perhaps in those early days it would have been the image of being cast out, friendless, ignored. But as time passed and his choices calcified into consequences, that fear evolved. By the time he died, his terror was no longer of loneliness. It was of judgment, of facing the three who had once trusted him with their lives, the ones who had called him brother. Peter's death came in the strangest of ways, not by wand but by his own hand, or more precisely, his own silver hand, a gift from Voldemort, enchanted to obey only him. When Peter hesitated, when he felt a flicker of mercy toward Harry, his own hand turned against him. It was poetic in its cruelty. The boy who betrayed to survive was undone by a loyalty spell. That moment, frozen in time, is perhaps the clearest window into Peter's soul. He did not want to kill, he did not want to die, but he had made himself into a creature with no choices left. Throughout the series, Peter is rarely shown as evil in the traditional sense. He is not a maniac like Bellatrix, nor a strategist like Lucius Malfoy. He is weak. Weakness in the Harry Potter universe is often more dangerous than evil. Voldemort could not have touched Harry if not for Peter. Cedric Diggory would not have died in the graveyard had Peter not helped resurrect the Dark Lord. The Second Wizarding War began not with an army but with a whisper, a rat's whisper. There's something deeply tragic in Peter's arc. He wanted to belong. In school, he basked in the protection of the marauders. As an adult, he clung to Voldemort for safety. Even in death, his moment of hesitation came from seeing Harry, James's son, his old friend's legacy, bound and helpless. Perhaps for a second he remembered the boy he had been, the ones he had laughed with, the ones he had doomed, and in that moment he tried to be someone better. But it was too late. Number 18, Fred and George Weasley, the death of the other twin. Fred and George Weasley were born seconds apart, but their bond ran deeper than mere genetics or shared birthdays. They moved through the world as two halves of a single soul, laughing in perfect synchrony, finishing each other's thoughts and building a life around chaos and joy. Their pranks, their inventions, their very identities were entwined. To imagine one without the other was like imagining magic without wands. Technically possible, but fundamentally wrong. And so if a boggart ever slithered out of a wardrobe to face them, it would likely wear the most terrifying guise either could fathom, the lifeless body of the other, cold, still, and forever silent. For Fred, the boggart would take George's face, his mirror, his double, eyes closed not in laughter, but in death. No mischievous smirk curling the lips, no sparkle of rebellion, just the heavy weight of absence in a room that once echoed with shared jokes and secret glances. And for George, it would be Fred he saw, perhaps in the aftermath of an explosion gone wrong, one not born of fun but of war, lying broken in the rubble of a shattered dream. This wasn't merely the fear of losing a loved one. It was the terror of losing a part of oneself. For them, there was no singular existence. Life was a duet. Their humour, infectious and seemingly superficial, served as both mask and armour. Hogwarts knew them as the school's resident tricksters, the inventors of skiving snack boxes, the masterminds behind the unforgettable fireworks rebellion against Dolores Umbridge. But beneath that comedy lay something deeper, a fierce, unspoken loyalty, a devotion that transcended brotherhood. They didn't need to say it aloud. Their very presence at each other's side was proof. In a world teetering on the edge of darkness, their mischief was not just entertainment, it was defiance. Joy as resistance. Fred and George didn't fear Voldemort. They didn't fear detentions, curses, or even Azkaban. But they would fear what a boggart might show, not because it would be gory or grotesque, but because it would be honest. It would be the one thing they couldn't joke away. Picture it, a boggart shifting shape, a crowd gathered in the classroom, and suddenly George sees Fred, eyes glassy, chest unmoving, the ever-present grin wiped clean by silence. Or Fred sees George lying beneath a bloodied tangle of rubble, a joke half told, never to be finished. That is the moment when laughter would vanish, and something ancient and primal would take its place. Grief. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Molly Weasley faces a boggart that morphs into the dead bodies of her children. She breaks down when it shows her Fred. It's a harrowing glimpse into maternal terror, but it also foreshadows something the books don't say outright, that the twins' fate would never be separated by age, by rivalry, or by choice, but only by death. And when that moment finally arrives, when Fred falls during the Battle of Hogwarts, it is not just a name struck from the family tree, it is a fracture, an unnatural dismembering of a whole. George, who had lost an ear during the earlier battles, once joked about being holy. But when Fred died, it wasn't just his ear that was gone, it was his voice, his echo, his alignment in the universe. After the war, George couldn't produce a Patronus anymore. He couldn't enter the shop they had built without feeling the absence in every shelf. According to J.K. Rowling, he never truly got over it. He married, yes, he had children, but the laughter that once rolled easily from his lips became something more subdued, more forced. The brightest firework had fizzled. When the boggart takes Fred's form for George or George's form for Fred, it isn't dramatized for horror. There's no blood, no dramatics, just that quiet, unbearable stillness. That silence that doesn't belong to either of them, because silence was never their domain. They were sound, shouting, whooping, whispering, conspiring. And in that moment, with the boggart's cruel mimicry, one is forced to stand in a world of quiet. Alone, their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, was a monument to their creativity and unity. It wasn't just a business, it was their shared dream made manifest. The colours, the explosions, the whimsical chaos of the storefront, all of it spoke to their inner world. After Fred's death, George kept it going, but the building was never quite the same. There were rumours he left Fred's favourite workspace untouched, that he still heard his brother's laughter echo in the halls. A joke once shared became an echo chamber. Even during their Hogwarts years, their dynamic made it nearly impossible for others to tell them apart. Not just in appearance, but in mannerism, in timing, in thought. They had their own language, punctuated with raised eyebrows and half-smiles. They were synchronized, like twin phoenixes soaring together through the storm. For one to fall meant the other would never fly the same again. Imagine a scene in Professor Lupin's classroom. A group of students, nervous and excited. The wardrobe creaks open, the boggart leaps forward, and there stands Fred, arms limp, chest unmoving, lips blue. George recoils not from fear but from a wound that hasn't yet happened. Or perhaps it's Fred who sees George, eyes staring into a void he can't reach. The room holds its breath. The joke ends. What spell could one cast against such a boggart? Ridiculous feels cruelly ironic. Turn death into a punchline, dress the corpse in a tutu, make it dance. There's no laughter in this fear, no twist that makes it less real. Because the worst part of this vision isn't that it could happen, it's that it does. And that it did, and that no matter how powerful the magic, it cannot be undone. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Fred dies with a laugh on his lips, a moment of light in darkness, snatched away by an explosion. Percy, who had just reconciled with him, is there. George is not, and perhaps it's a mercy, perhaps that's the only reason. George survives at all. Had he seen it, had he held Fred's broken body in the final moments, he may not have emerged from that castle at all. But even in absence, the pain finds him, and stays. Years later, at family gatherings, there's always an empty chair. A joke left half-spoken. A moment when everyone laughs and then looks at George and the room goes quiet. He tries to smile, but it doesn't reach his eyes, because that laugh, they always did it best together. The boggart, then, is not just a reflection of fear, it is a prophecy, a cruel promise that one day the mirror would crack, that the echo would fade, that laughter would become memory. For Fred and George, the boggart isn't a monster in a cupboard, it's reality, waiting, patient, unstoppable. And yet they lived without fear until the very end. They stood for something more, not just joy but rebellion, not just jokes but resistance. Even their final acts were defiant. Fred died fighting, laughing, living on his terms. That is his legacy. And George, in carrying that legacy, bears the burden of both. J.K. Rowling once revealed that George would never be whole again, that naming his son Fred was not a tribute, it was an attempt at healing. But some wounds don't close, some losses remain raw. The boggart, then, is not defeated, it waits, behind every door, in every quiet moment, in every echo of shared laughter, for those who loved them. Ron, Ginny, Hermione, even Harry, Fred and George were a singular force. One without the other felt unnatural, unstable. Harry once said, "You couldn't tell where Fred ended and George began." That was their power. That was their curse. So when George faced his boggart, it wasn't just Fred lying there. It was himself, hollowed out, an empty vessel walking through life with only half a heart. And when Fred saw George in that state, it was not just the loss of a brother. It was the death of a witness, the one person who truly knew him. There is no victory against such a boggart, only the courage to face it, to breathe through it, to carry it. Fred and George, in their way, did just that. Every joke, every invention, every burst of colour in a grey world, they were not distractions, they were declarations. We are alive, we are together, we are whole. Until they weren't. Number 19. Cho Chang, losing loved ones again. There is something haunting about Cho Chang that few fans pause to explore. Among the many students at Hogwarts, she is one of the most quietly tragic figures. Beneath the surface of the Ravenclaw Seeker, known for her beauty and poise, lies a story deeply woven with loss, fear, and the quiet ache of solitude. After the death of Cedric Diggory, Cho's life was altered in ways that magic could not mend, and her possible boggart, a dark and shapeless creature that assumes the form of what its victim fears most, might well have revealed not a monster, but a memory she never chose to keep. When Cedric Diggory died during the Triwizard Tournament, he left more than just a void in the world of Hufflepuff. He left behind an unspoken promise between two young hearts that never had the time to bloom. Cho had looked forward to their future with the quiet optimism of someone who had finally found something pure in a world growing darker by the day. Cedric was kind, brave, and had that rare calm that made others feel safe. But the return of Voldemort shattered the innocence of many Hogwarts students, and for Cho, it took everything. Had a boggart risen before her in the Room of Requirement, it would not have turned into a Dementor or a bloodied beast. It would have taken Cedric's form, just as she remembered him, but wrong in the ways that nightmares are wrong. Cedric, standing upright, still in his Hogwarts robes, his hair slightly tousled from a Quidditch match, but his skin ashen. His eyes open but lifeless, and perhaps on his face a faint accusation. "Why are you still here?" the expression would seem to ask, though no words would leave his lips. Cho's greatest fear was not death itself, but the unbearable guilt of survival. She feared the day she would fall in love again, because love meant risk, and risk meant the possibility of repeating the same horror. The guilt of joy after tragedy can be the heaviest curse. How does one let go of the dead without feeling disloyal? How does one move forward when the shadow of yesterday follows so closely? Before Cedric's death, Cho was known for her laugh, a soft, lilting sound that often echoed across the Quidditch pitch. But after, that laugh was rarely heard. Her friends noticed the change. She became quieter, more guarded. The Ravenclaw common room, once a place of joyful chatter and study, now became a refuge for silent reflection. She often sat by the window, watching the grey sky above the towers of Hogwarts, lost in thoughts that had no words. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, we see the aftermath of her grief manifest in complex ways. Harry, too, had witnessed Cedric's death and carried his own guilt. But while Harry's pain turned into rage and a thirst for justice, Cho's pain lingered in a more delicate form. She cried during their date at Madame Puddifoot's tea shop, overwhelmed by emotion, unable to control the tide within her. The world saw her tears as awkward, but grief is never tidy, and Cho's sorrow was never something she could easily contain. In that moment, Harry failed to understand the depth of her mourning, and Cho, already battling feelings of confusion and shame, found herself more alone than ever. The quote from the book reveals it clearly. A slightly watery smile appeared on Cho's face. "Look, let's not talk about Cedric right now, so, do you want to come with me to the ball?" Even in asking Harry out, her voice trembles with the presence of Cedric's memory. She tries to compartmentalize, to act normal, but Cedric's absence is always the ghost in the room. For Cho, love and connection had always been tied to vulnerability. To open one's heart was to accept the terrifying risk of loss. Cedric had opened her heart for the first time in a way that was real. His death wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the violent rupture of trust in the world itself. Trust that good things lasted, trust that love didn't come with punishment. And so her fear grew, not just of death, but of life after death, the kind of life where you smile with guilt, laugh with hesitation, and love with restraint. Had Professor Lupin still taught Defense Against the Dark Arts during her 5th year, and had he instructed the students to face a Boggart, Cho's reaction might have stunned the class. Some would see spiders or banshees, others failing grades or family members in peril. But Cho's would be Cedric, not as he was in life, but as he appeared in her worst dreams. A hollow version of himself. Eyes open, accusing, silent, a version that asked without speaking, "Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you come?" The guilt Cho felt was irrational, as guilt often is. She had no part in Cedric's death. She had no warning. She could not have changed the outcome. Yet the mind does not obey logic when grief burrows deep. Her fear of being alone was not rooted in solitude itself, but in the echoing silence that comes after losing someone you loved without ever having the chance to say goodbye properly. There was no closure, no last moment of warmth, only the news and the cruel, brutal finality. This is why Cho's later attempt to join Dumbledore's army is so powerful. It is not just an act of rebellion or bravery, it is a cry for control in a world that had taken so much from her. She wants to fight, not just against Umbridge or Voldemort, but against the helplessness that defined her past year. She wants to take back the narrative of her own life. But even this attempt ends in heartbreak when her friend Marietta Edgecombe betrays the group, forcing Cho further into isolation. Once again, her attempt to connect, to belong, is punished. Ravenclaws are known for their intellect and wisdom, but emotional resilience is not always taught in books. Cho's suffering was an emotional puzzle she could not solve with logic. She was caught between the memories of a lost love and the demands of a war that asked young people to grow up too fast. She was barely 16, carrying wounds that some adults would never heal from, and yet she endured. When Harry breaks off their connection, Cho is once again faced with the quiet echo of rejection. It is not as violent as Cedric's death, but it reinforces her growing belief that intimacy leads to loss, that love is a luxury she can no longer afford. Her Boggart grows stronger, not weaker, because with each failed connection, each broken thread, her fear of permanent loneliness grows. The world expected her to heal on a schedule it could understand, but grief does not work like that. The Boggart in Cho's life never needed to transform into monsters to terrify her. It was always in the form of love, twisted by fate, of connection severed by death or betrayal. Her greatest fear was not pain, it was the knowledge that love might be the prelude to abandonment. Even as the Battle of Hogwarts loomed, Cho's bravery was not in the form of grand speeches or daring spells. It was quieter. It was in showing up despite the ghosts that haunted her, in choosing to return to a school filled with memories of Cedric, in facing the very walls that once held her dreams, in standing among friends and fighting for the hope that others would not suffer as she had. We never learn what became of Cho Chang after the war, but one might imagine that even years later her Boggart would remain Cedric, standing in silence, waiting to be freed from the shadow of her guilt, unless perhaps she found a way to transform that image, not with laughter, but with forgiveness, not with forgetting, but with understanding that love and loss are two sides of the same coin. Boggarts feed on fear, but they are defeated not with brute force, but with clarity, with the ability to laugh, not at the fear itself, but at the illusion of its power. For Cho, that journey was never simple. Her Boggart was a mirror, not a monster, a reminder of the fragility of joy, a test she faced every time she dared to care again. The Harry Potter series never painted Cho Chang as a villain or a heroine. She was simply a girl caught in the crossfire of war and heartbreak, trying to find her voice amid the noise of grief. She loved, she lost, and she kept moving. And in that there is a quiet heroism, a kind that doesn't make headlines but lingers in the spaces between the lines. If ever a future professor asked her to cast ridiculous, what would she picture to break the spell? Perhaps Cedric, covered in chocolate frogs. Perhaps the haunting figure would break into dance, awkwardly waving a wand like he used to during practice. Perhaps Cho would laugh, not because the image is funny, but because it is healing, because memory, when touched by time and courage, can become a friend instead of a fear. And perhaps in that moment the Boggart would vanish, not in fear, but in peace. Number 20, Sybill Trelawney, her normal self without any magical gift. In the flickering candlelight of the North Tower, wrapped in swirling veils and thick perfume, Professor Sybill Trelawney often appeared more myth than mortal. Her voice, tremulous, distant, occasionally unnerving, seemed to float above the teacups and incense smoke like an echo from another world. To students like Hermione Granger, she was at best a fraud, and at worst a self-deluded eccentric. But the truth of Sybill Patricia Trelawney runs far deeper than a few questionable predictions and dramatic flair. At the heart of her character lies a fear so consuming it could shatter her very identity, the fear that she is, in fact, ordinary. Her possible Boggart would not be some fearsome beast or grotesque creature, but something infinitely more haunting. It would be herself, stripped of layers, robbed of her velvet shawls, her clinking bangles, her trailing sleeves. It would be Sybill as a simple woman, wearing a plain skirt and sensible shoes, her wild hair tamed, her trademark spectacles gone, no crystal ball, no shimmering inner eye, just a woman, nameless and unnoticed, devoid of magic, devoid of meaning. That is the horror Sybill cannot bear to face. This fear is not rooted in arrogance or vanity, as some might assume. It is born of fragility, of the deep-rooted uncertainty that has plagued her since childhood. As the great-great-granddaughter of the celebrated seer Cassandra Trelawney, Sybill had expectations hanging over her like storm clouds. Her lineage was legendary, but the talent, that was elusive. She made her way to Hogwarts not as a proven seer, but as a desperate woman seeking validation. Even Albus Dumbledore, when first interviewing her for the divination position, nearly dismissed her, until the unexpected happened. It was in the shadowy corner of the Hog's Head that she gave her first true prophecy, not even conscious of having done so. Her body stiffened, her voice deepened, and the words that fell from her lips foretold the rise of Lord Voldemort, and the child who would have the power to vanquish him. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Dumbledore recognized the gravity of her utterance and gave her the job, not because of what she was, but because of what she had accidentally become. But Sybill never remembered that prophecy. It remained a blank spot in her memory, a divine accident she could not recreate at will. From then on, her career was a strange balancing act. She needed to justify her place among giants like McGonagall, Flitwick and Snape, while clinging desperately to a gift that was often questioned. The other professors mostly dismissed her, and even students mocked her classes. When Hermione famously walked out of divination, declaring it a load of rubbish, it wounded more than Sybill's pride. It chipped away at her identity. Trelawney poured her soul into her performance, embracing the theatrical, the mystical, the dramatic. It wasn't fakery, it was defense. Every shawl, every charm around her neck was armor, every cryptic phrase a shield. She wasn't trying to deceive others. She was trying to keep herself from crumbling under the weight of her own self-doubt. The constant incense, the hazy lighting, the elaborate symbolism, they weren't props. They were her scaffolding. Take them away. And she feared she would fall. If a boggart were to emerge before her, twisting into her deepest fear, it would not roar or lunge. It would stand still, adjusting a plain cardigan, perhaps holding a grocery list or a bus schedule. It would be her as a muggle schoolteacher, perhaps in a dusty classroom, without magic, her voice ignored, her words without consequence. No mysticism, no destiny, just silence. To Sybill, that is terror incarnate. During the events of Order of the Phoenix, when Dolores Umbridge attempted to remove her from Hogwarts, Sybill's terror briefly became reality. As she stood, sobbing on the stone steps, her trunks scattered and her eyes wild, she was not just a dismissed teacher, she was a woman being stripped of her identity. "You can't do this!" she cried, but Umbridge had the law, and Sybill had only her shreds of mysticism. Were it not for Dumbledore's intervention, she might have faded into obscurity, a casualty of bureaucratic cruelty. In those days, she became a ghost within her own walls, shuffling through corridors with a bottle of sherry and eyes that seemed older than time. She became, for a moment, that plain version of herself, cast out, dismissed, disregarded. The fear she had long buried beneath silk scarves and swirling incense had materialized, and it broke her. The second prophecy she would make, the one to Harry Potter, when she fell again into trance and spoke of the Dark Lord's servant returning, was made not in glory, but in the haze of self-loathing and wine. And yet it was real, it was powerful. It reminded us that her gift, rare though it might be, was true. What Sybill feared more than anything was not being wrong. She could endure mockery, she could handle doubt, but to be unremarkable, to be nobody, that would be her undoing. That is why her boggart would show her a life devoid of enchantment, no whisper of destiny, no second sight, just a quiet room, a ticking clock, and the knowledge that she would live and die unremembered. Sybill Trelawney's divination classroom was not just a teaching space, it was her sanctuary. The heavy drapes, the circular tables, the scent of burning sage, it was her attempt to recreate the atmosphere of revelation, to summon the divine. She created a temple, and in it She played both priestess and oracle. The students might have smirked, but for Sybill it was sacred. If she could not constantly touch the otherworldly, then she could at least live among its trappings. Even her most ridiculous predictions, like foretelling Harry's death each term, came from a desperate yearning to prove she still had it. Every grim, every portent, every trembling warning, she wasn't trying to frighten. She was trying to matter. She was trying to speak a language only she could hear, hoping someone, someday, would understand. Consider the way she treated Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil, her most devoted students. She didn't favor them for their talent. She favored them for their belief. They made her feel seen. Their gasps, their eager nods, their reverence, they validated her existence. They gave her hope that she was not alone in seeing beyond the veil. In contrast, Hermione represented the worst of Sibyl's fears, rational, unimpressed, immune to mystery. Hermione didn't just question Sibyl's gift, she denied its possibility. And Sybill could not fight logic with incense. It's no surprise, then, that Sybill found some solace in Firenze, the centaur who took over part of her teaching duties. Though their relationship was rocky at first, Firenze too believed in fate, in signs, in prophecy. They shared the burden of seeing truths others could not. When she said, "He is no seer," referring to Firenze, she was not protecting her title. She was clinging to exclusivity. If everyone could see, what made her special? Her fragility is perhaps most evident in Half-Blood Prince, when she speaks with Dumbledore and confesses, "I had no idea when I had told the prophecy to you." That moment, quiet, tragic, reveals how little control she had over the only thing that gave her life meaning. The prophecy had changed the course of history, but she had been merely the vessel. Even her greatest moment had not been hers. It had passed through her like smoke, and yet there is something noble in her perseverance. Despite the ridicule, despite the doubt, Sybill never abandoned her post. She remained in the tower, peering into tea leaves, interpreting the dance of planets, searching the skies for truths hidden from ordinary eyes. She believed. She had to believe, because if she didn't, then what remained? The tragedy of Sybill Trelawney is not that she was eccentric. It's that she was fragile in a world that demands certainty. She was mystical in a castle of scholars, emotional in a sea of reason. She was the whisper in the storm, the flicker in the dark, the hint of something greater. And she lived every day fearing that it was all in her head. In a world where power is often loud, where Voldemort's terror and Dumbledore's wisdom shape fates, Sibyl's magic is quiet. It is the possibility of insight, it is the fear of being wrong, and the terror of being ordinary. Her Boggart, then, is the echo of a life that never mattered, a life where Sybill was just another woman at the market blending in, unseen. But even in that fear there is humanity. Sybill Trelawney teaches us that identity is fragile, that belief is a shield, and that even the smallest light is worthy of reverence. Her fear of being nothing is, in a way, what made her something. She is not a joke, she is not a fraud, she is a woman who once whispered the fate of the wizarding world in a dusty tavern and forgot she had done it. She is a woman who feared her own reflection, not for its truth but for its emptiness, and perhaps in that fear she is more real than we ever dared to believe. Number 21, Dolores Umbridge, Muggle officials running the ministry. Of all the dark and unsettling characters in the wizarding world, few cast a longer shadow than Dolores Jane Umbridge. Clad in pink and surrounded by kitten plates, she exuded an unsettling sweetness that barely masked her fanaticism. But beneath her saccharine smile and cruel punishments lay a fear far deeper than any creature in the Forbidden Forest. Unlike most who feared death, pain, or loss, Umbridge's terror was political and systemic. If faced with a boggart, it would not transform into a Dementor or a corpse. It would become something far worse in her eyes. A group of Muggle officials seated in the polished offices of the Ministry of Magic, holding wands they did not earn, stamping laws she did not approve, dismantling the order she lived to protect. Dolores Umbridge's life was defined by her obsession with hierarchy and purity. A half-blood herself, She despised the part of her lineage that tied her to the non-magical world. This wasn't mere prejudice, it was rooted in denial. Her mother was a Muggle, and her brother was a Squib. Facts that Dolores buried so deeply, she rewrote her own past. The idea of Muggles rising to positions of magical authority, not just within society but in the very ministry that defined wizarding order, would have been the ultimate nightmare. Her identity was built on a fragile illusion of superiority. A Muggle with a ministry seal in hand threatened to shatter the illusion with the cruel clarity of reality. When she assumed power at Hogwarts, the educational decrees she issued weren't just about order. They were about reinforcing a world where magic remained in the hands of those she deemed worthy. "Progress for the sake of progress must be discouraged," she once proclaimed. But what she truly meant was, "Progress that threatens my vision of the world must be stopped." Her tyranny over the students, especially those born to Muggle parents like Hermione Granger, reveals her fear of the collapse of magical aristocracy. It wasn't enough to hate Muggles, she needed to suppress those who bridged the two worlds. Imagine the Boggarts slowly emerging from the cabinet in a darkened office of the ministry. It begins to twist, its form unsure, and then with a crack it shifts. Muggle officials in tailored suits seated in the minister's conference room, adjusting their ties, raising their pens, whispering incantations they shouldn't know. One of them signs a decree with a Muggle pen, and the parchment glows with enchantment. Dolores gasps, not because she fears their violence, but because she fears their competence. Her world, so carefully ordered, is being rewritten by people she considers unworthy. She fears a future in which the barriers between magical and non-magical are blurred, a ministry led not by pure-blood wizards with ancient names, but by those born in hospitals without magical wards, raised in homes without enchanted portraits. That terror is not rooted in physical danger, but in existential threat. Dolores does not fear death, she fears irrelevance. The image of Muggles taking her seat, touching her documents, and passing legislation she cannot control is the truest reflection of her soul's torment. Her role during the Second Wizarding War revealed this fear in action. Though she claimed loyalty to the ministry and to the rule of law, she eagerly embraced the regime that installed blood status as a legal requirement. She wore the locket of Salazar Slytherin around her neck like a relic of divine order. She justified the prosecution of Muggle-born witches and wizards under the pretense of stolen magic. These actions weren't just for power, they were desperate attempts to keep the world she feared at bay. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when Harry sees her in the courtroom, it's not just cruelty he sees, it's obsession. She sends Muggle-borns to Azkaban not because they are dangerous, but because their very existence undermines everything she built her beliefs upon. "You are not a witch," she tells Mary Cattermole coldly, while holding a wand she confiscated. The symbolism is striking. She strips others of magic, of authority, of identity, just as she fears it might one day be stripped from her. Dolores Umbridge's terror lies in transformation. She doesn't dread dragons or werewolves. She dreads change. She fears a ministry where surnames like Shacklebolt or Granger, or even Potter, are more revered than Black or Malfoy. She fears her pink walls replaced by glass and steel, her teacups replaced by collaboration. The image of Muggles not needing her permission to exist in her world, to influence it, to shape its laws, that is a horror no dark creature could match. Her Boggart is a political revolution wrapped in business suits and reason. They do not shout, they do not fight, they simply exist where they should not. They replace her without bloodshed, without resistance, without even acknowledging her. That's the most terrifying part. In her nightmare, she isn't overthrown, she's forgotten. Her ideology crumbles not in flame, but in silence, as the world moves on without her. Unlike Voldemort, who fears death, or Snape, who fears exposure, Umbridge fears displacement. Her legacy, meticulously crafted through manipulation and cruelty, is fragile. It can be undone by children with good hearts or Muggles with good ideas. Her smile, so tight and artificial, is the mask of someone holding on to a world slipping through her fingers. And that Boggart, those Muggles in seats of power is not just a vision of fear, it's a prophecy she fights every day. Her hatred of Muggles is, at its core, rooted in fear of inferiority. As a half-blood, she overcompensated by aligning with pure-blood supremacy. She believed that only by enforcing strict boundaries could she ensure her own place. The idea that those boundaries might fall, that her rules might no longer apply, that is the terror that wakes her in the night. A world where everyone belongs means that no one is special, and Dolores Umbridge needs to be special. She would not scream at the sight of her boggart. She would likely try to control it, speak over it, deny its presence. But the trembling of her hands, the tightness of her jaw, the way her wand falters in her grip, those would betray her. Her power has always been an illusion maintained by structure. The boggart exposes the foundation of sand beneath her ministry-approved heels. When she punished students with quills that etched words into their skin, she was sending a message. You will not challenge this order, yet it is precisely that challenge that haunts her. Children born to Muggles growing into powerful witches and wizards are living proof that bloodlines mean nothing. That truth is the knife at the throat of everything she stands for. She hides it under rules, robes, and rows of kitten plates, but it festers. Even among the Death Eaters she was seen as a tool, not a visionary. She was never marked with the dark mark. She did not believe in Voldemort's madness, only his structure. She served a regime that promised to halt the chaos she feared, to turn back time to when people like her could thrive. But that time was never real, it was always a myth. And myths cannot protect you when the world changes. In that sense, Umbridge represents a deeper kind of villainy than Voldemort. She is not driven by trauma or prophecy. She is driven by preservation. Her evil is bureaucratic, subtle, and coated in civility. She doesn't want to destroy the world. She wants to preserve her version of it, no matter who gets crushed in the process. Her boggart reminds us that evil doesn't always wear a skull mask. Sometimes it wears a pink cardigan and sips tea. Her greatest fear is not that the world ends, it's that it evolves, that Muggles and magical folk find ways to coexist, that a young witch from a Muggle home might sit in the minister's chair and smile at her with kindness instead of fear. That kindness, that inclusivity, would destroy her, because in such a world there is no place for Dolores Umbridge, not because she is persecuted, but because she is irrelevant. She clings to parchment and protocol like lifelines. She weaponizes rules and traditions, twisting them to keep the tides of change at bay. Her boggart is not chaos, it is order that she does not control, harmony she did not authorize, and in her mind, that is worse than any monster. The ministry belongs to her kind, the laws, the spells, the culture. It must all remain under her gaze, or it becomes unnatural. In the end, her fear is more terrifying than any spell, because it is the kind of fear that builds walls, not to keep evil out, but to keep progress away. And that boggart, those Muggles with ministry seals, is not just a figment of imagination. It is a future that's coming. And she knows it. Number 22, Lily Potter, Voldemort standing over Harry. There is a kind of fear that is not loud, it does not scream or run. It does not show itself with trembling hands or widened eyes. It is quiet, cold, and absolute. It is the kind of fear that makes a mother stand still, knowing that death is near, and still not stepping aside. That was the fear that lived in Lily Potter's heart. Not fear for herself, but fear of what might happen to her child. If a boggart had ever slithered from a dark wardrobe in front of Lily, it would not have shown her own death. It would have taken the form of Voldemort, tall and robed in shadow, raising his wand above the cradle of her baby son, Harry. The absence of an actual scene where Lily faces a boggart does not take away from the certainty of this image. There is no need for a demonstration when her entire life and her death speaks with such clarity. In contrast to James, whose bravery danced with recklessness and laughter, Lily's courage was the type born of deep, unwavering love. Her soul burned quietly, but it was fierce. Her greatest fear was not pain. It was not death. It was loss. The irreversible kind of loss that would come if Voldemort's curse reached her child. We know that Boggarts reflect not just fears, but the emotional centre of a person's deepest anxieties. For Molly Weasley, it was the image of her family dead before her eyes. For Remus Lupin, the full moon, his own condition, the monster within. And for Lily, it could only have been the figure who marked her baby for death. Her fear had a name: Tom Riddle, Lord Voldemort, the Dark Lord. But the form was not Voldemort alone. It was Voldemort above Harry, wand raised, about to end what had barely begun. There is a particular weight to Lily's story because her fear came true. The boggart, in her case, stepped out of imagination and into the nursery at Godric's Hollow. It wore a cloak, it raised a wand, and it asked her to move, but Lily did not flinch. What is terrifying for others became her battleground. She stood between Voldemort and Harry, not because she thought she could stop the curse, but because she could not bear the alternative. The fear of her child dying alone, unprotected, helpless, that was her nightmare. She met it with outstretched arms. J.K. Rowling gives us this moment without embellishment, but with stunning finality. Voldemort himself recalls it with disdain, saying, "Your mother died trying to protect you. Now give me the stone, unless you want her to have died in vain." But her death was not in vain. Her death was her answer to the boggart she never had to see. She transformed her worst fear into an act of defiance. She weaponized it with love. There's something devastating about the simplicity of Lily's choice. She had been offered a way out. Voldemort did not come to kill her. He offered her a chance to live. "Stand aside, girl," he shouted according to his own memory. "Stand aside, silly girl. Stand aside now." She could have lived, but she stayed, because living without Harry would have been worse than dying. This makes her different from many others who joined the Order of the Phoenix. Many were brave, many fought, many died. But Lily's final stand was not about ideology. It was not a war fought with wands or spells. It was a single choice in a quiet room, where the only sound was the soft breathing of a baby and the closing steps of evil. The boggart in that moment would not have needed to take another form. The room itself became the nightmare, and Lily Potter stood in its centre. What makes this fear even more profound is that it was not hypothetical. Lily had known the prophecy. Dumbledore later explains to Harry, "You are the boy who lived because of your mother's sacrifice, because she died to save you." That choice, made in the heat of terror, was rooted in knowledge. She knew the Dark Lord was coming for Harry. She knew the prophecy had named him. And yet she stayed. She held him, kissed his head, and waited. The image of Voldemort above the cradle was not just her fear, it was her destiny. And she walked into it with open eyes. Her love was not passive. It was not a whisper or a promise. It was a spell of the oldest kind, deeper than magic itself. That is why Voldemort's curse rebounded, why he was destroyed, not just physically, but metaphysically. He could not understand the magic that came from choosing love over fear. He had seen Lily's boggart and assumed it was weakness. He did not see the power in it, the strength it gave her, the spell that did not need a wand. There's irony in how Voldemort misunderstood Lily. He saw her as a threat only when she refused to move. He did not comprehend that she was already the shield, the wall, the final line. Her fear made her powerful. She had already died in her heart the moment she heard he was coming. The rest was simply following through on a promise she had made when Harry was born, to never let anything hurt him. We can imagine the boggart forming in the air, shifting into the shadow of a man with red eyes and a baby clutched in a crib, crying, unaware of danger. That image would have paralyzed many. But for Lily, it would have clarified everything. That was the image she was willing to fight. She had faced prejudice, war, betrayal, and loss, but that moment, that one fear, defined her, because she did not run from it. Her legacy is built on that fear, not in submission to it, but in resistance against it. Every time Harry says his mother's name, it is a tribute to that choice. Every time he casts a Patronus, a spell rooted in love and memory, her shadow moves with him. And so, the boggart that might have haunted her never had a chance to frighten her. It only confirmed who she truly was. In a strange way, Lily's greatest fear became her greatest strength. It shaped her final act, and that act created a shield so powerful that even the killing curse could not break it. This is not metaphor. This is the magic that lives at the core of the Harry Potter story, the idea that love, in the face of fear, is the most powerful force in the world. And Lily embodied that in a way no one else could. Sirius Black, who loved both James and Lily, says to Harry once, "You're not a bad person. You're a very good person who had bad things happen to you." But what he does not say, what he perhaps doesn't need to say, is that Harry's goodness came from somewhere, from someone, from the woman whose fear became his armor, whose love, cast in the moment of her greatest terror, became the spell that saved the world. This also sets Lily apart from many mothers in the wizarding world, not because they wouldn't do the same, but because she did. She lived the fear and still stood tall. Narcissa Malfoy also defied Voldemort later, but she did it with deceit. Molly Weasley fought with fury, but Lily Potter stood with silence and open arms. Her fear did not scream. It stood still. Dumbledore himself recognized the magnitude of that moment. In the Philosopher's Stone, he tells Harry, "To have been loved so deeply, even though the person who loved us is gone, will give us some protection forever." It is an echo of the truth Lily lived. Her love, her fear transformed, became eternal. Perhaps that is why her boggart would not just be an image of Voldemort. It would be a scene, a memory, a reenactment of the worst moment imaginable, over and over again. The door opens. The footsteps climb the stairs. The shadow falls across the crib. The wand is raised. That is the image that would break her. That is the image she broke. Her story is not one of defeat. It is one of transcendence. Lily Potter did not merely survive her fear. She turned it into a miracle. Her final moments were not filled with magic in the traditional sense, but they created the foundation for a magical future. Harry was saved, and through him, the world was given a second chance. We often think of heroes as those who wield power, but Lily's heroism was in her refusal to wield it. In that nursery, she did not lift her wand. She did not duel. She simply stood in front of her child and said, in every cell of her being, "You will not pass." It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was absolute. That is why, if we ever had the chance to peek into the mind of a boggart facing Lily Evans Potter, it would not be a beast, a ghost, or a storm. It would be a scene, a moment, a dark-robed figure towering over a crib, a mother watching helplessly, except she was not helpless. She was the storm that stopped death in its tracks. Her fear was never weakness. It was prophecy, it was purpose. It was the echo of a love so fierce that it shattered the rules of life and death. Lily Potter's boggart never needed to appear. She met it willingly, and in doing so, she destroyed it. Number 23, Aberforth Dumbledore. Albus and Grindelwald united again. Aberforth Dumbledore's life had always been shaped by what happened in the shadows of someone else's greatness. While the wizarding world spoke the name Albus Dumbledore with reverence, the name Aberforth was often mentioned only in passing, if at all. To many, he was just the gruff owner of the Hog's Head Inn, a man with a crooked nose and no appetite for fame or elegant speech. But within that weathered figure lay a heart scarred by tragedy, disappointment, and the enduring pain of betrayal. He was not merely the brother of the greatest wizard of the age. He was the brother of a man who, in Aberforth's eyes, chose ambition over family. If Aberforth were ever to face a boggart, its form might not be monstrous or grotesque. It would be elegant, composed, and profoundly devastating. Albus Dumbledore and Gellert Grindelwald standing side by side once again. this image would be more than a phantasm conjured by fear. It would be a ghost of the past, a manifestation of his deepest torment. Aberforth was never a man afraid of death, nor of pain. He had witnessed too much of both. His fear was more insidious. It lived in the quiet corners of memory, in the image of two young men standing on a summer hillside, heads bowed together in intense discussion, their eyes alight with visions of a reformed world. The sight of Albus and Gellert rekindling that alliance, even in illusion, would pierce Aberforth more than any spell. It was the dream that stole his brother away, and ultimately shattered their family. The summer of 1899 had begun like any other, with the Dumbledore family cloaked in the quiet sorrow that had come to define them. Their sister, Ariana, remained fragile, a young girl damaged by an attack from Muggle boys who had seen her perform magic. Kendra Dumbledore, their mother, shouldered the burden of care until the magic within Ariana lashed out and killed her in an accidental outburst. Albus returned home from Hogwarts full of promise and brilliance, now burdened with responsibility. But that summer, fate brought Gellert Grindelwald to Godric's Hollow, and everything changed. To Aberforth, Gellert had always been a flame too bright, too wild, too dangerous. He saw through the charm, through the vision of the greater good. Where Albus saw potential, Aberforth saw manipulation. The friendship between Albus and Gellert bloomed with frightening intensity. They spoke of revolution, of wizarding dominance over Muggles for their own protection, and of reshaping the world with their combined intellect and power. Albus, always the dreamer, had found a mirror in Gellert, a mirror that reflected ambition, not responsibility. Aberforth's warnings fell on deaf ears. He had tried to pull his brother back. He confronted Albus, pleaded with him to remember Ariana, to see the reality they lived in, not the utopia that only existed in his mind. But Albus, enraptured by Gellert's vision, resisted. "We were equals," Albus would later admit with a haunted tone. "We wanted to transform the world." It was in this resistance that the inevitable occurred. The three brothers, Albus, Gellert, and Aberforth, argued. Wands were drawn. In the chaos that followed, a curse struck Ariana, and she died. No one knew whose spell had killed her, and perhaps that uncertainty was the cruelest blow of all. For Aberforth, the image of his brother, standing beside the boy who brought so much ruin to their home, would forever represent a wound that never truly closed. "He gave it all up, you know," Aberforth later told Harry Potter. "But he didn't do it soon enough. If he had, she might have lived." His voice carried the pain of a lifetime. Years passed and Albus Dumbledore rose to fame. He became headmaster of Hogwarts' supreme mugwump, the architect of the resistance against dark magic. Meanwhile, Aberforth remained in the Hog's Head, tending bar, keeping goats, living a life deliberately small. But his simplicity was not born from failure, it was born from grief. Unlike Albus, Aberforth never sought to change the world. He only wanted to protect the ones he loved. And when that failed, he chose silence over ambition. It is no surprise, then, that Aberforth's greatest fear would not be of Grindelwald himself, but of the idea that Albus might again stand at his side, that the seductive power of change, cloaked in ideals, might once again eclipse love and loyalty. The boggart would take shape, elegant and composed, showing Albus and Gellert reunited, speaking in quiet tones about their grand designs, their eyes filled with the same light that had cost them Ariana. Aberforth would not see two visionaries. He would see two boys playing God again. The pain was not abstract, it was personal. When Harry met Aberforth during the Battle of Hogwarts, he saw a man, still bitter, still angry. "My brother sacrificed many things, Mr. Potter, on the altar of the greater good. I, for one, was one of them." The words were cold, but beneath them lay a lifetime of wounds, never healed. Aberforth was not a man of eloquence. He spoke plainly. But there was power in that plainness, a power rooted in truth. He never forgave Albus, not really. Even after Grindelwald's fall, even after Albus's death, the scar remained. Perhaps it was the ambiguity of it all that tormented him most. If Albus had clearly chosen evil, Aberforth could have hated him with clarity. But Albus had chosen love once, then lost it, then spent a lifetime atoning for it in ways Aberforth could not see. That complexity offered no peace. It only deepened the sorrow. Aberforth knew the world needed heroes, but he had watched as the pursuit of heroism cost him his sister. He believed in action, not ideals. And yet he had acted too late. The spell that killed Ariana could have come from any of them. That guilt, that uncertainty, bound the Dumbledore brothers in chains they carried to the grave. Albus sought redemption in the spotlight. Aberforth hid in the shadows. Both suffered in silence. To face a boggart is to confront the deepest corner of the soul. For many, it is a beast or a memory. For Aberforth, it would be a philosophical terror, the idea that his brother could betray them all again, the terror of history repeating itself. The idea that nothing had changed, that beneath all the accolades and wisdom, Albus might still believe in the dream that once destroyed them. One can imagine the boggart taking form in the dim cellar of the Hog's Head, perhaps drawn by a defense against the dark arts exercise gone awry. As the wardrobe creaks open, the familiar figures emerge. Albus in a long plum robe, eyes twinkling with the promise of brilliance. Gellert, younger and sharper, the glint of cunning in his gaze. They smile, not cruelly, but with purpose. Their voices are low, conspiratorial, and dangerous. Aberforth sees not two men, but a prophecy of disaster. The image would paralyze him, because deep down he never stopped fearing that Albus might still choose the idea over the person, that given another chance he might still reach out to Gellert, might still believe in that old vision, that everything Albus had done since, his guidance to Harry, his defeat of Grindelwald, even his death, might not have been enough to erase that first betrayal. That possibility, that whisper of doubt, would be the true horror. Aberforth's reaction to the boggart would not be theatrical. He would not scream or collapse. He would stare in silence, fists clenched, jaws set, his grief flooding back as fresh as it had been on the day of Ariana's death. That image would encapsulate everything he had lost, everything he had buried. Not just his sister, but his brother too. The Albus he had loved had died long before the world ever mourned him. When Albus faced his own boggart, if he ever did, it may have been Ariana's body, lifeless and still. But Aberforth's was more insidious. It was the choice Albus made, the alignment with Grindelwald, the willingness to dream at the expense of love. In that moment, the boggart would force Aberforth to relive the worst thing a man can experience, the helplessness of watching history begin its repetition and being unable to stop it. Yet even in that fear, there is something noble. Aberforth's boggart is not about personal safety. It is not about fame or pain. It is about the betrayal of values. He feared not evil, but the good man who might wander too close to darkness again. And in that, Aberforth proved himself as courageous as any wizard, not in spells or battles, but in choosing loyalty over legend and truth over dreams. He never sought applause. He never tried to explain himself to the world. But in that last hour, when Hogwarts was burning and death walked the halls, Aberforth stepped forward. He helped the students escape through the tunnel behind the portrait of Ariana. He fought. He stood not for glory, but for love. The same love that had once been ignored. Aberforth Dumbledore will never be remembered as the saviour of the wizarding world. His name will not be etched in goblets or carved into enchanted stones. But to understand the cost of greatness, one must look into the eyes of the one who was left behind. His boggart tells a story not of fear, but of mourning and the terrible weight of memory, and that perhaps is the most honest kind of bravery. Number 24. Lucius Malfoy, loss of status and exile from society. Lucius Malfoy stood as one of the most imposing figures in the corridors of power within the wizarding world. Cloaked in opulent robes of the finest silver-threaded fabric, with a serpent-handled cane that was more than just a symbol of wealth, it concealed his wand, his authority, and the dark legacy he carried. To the public he represented everything the old pure-blood family stood for: lineage, prestige, tradition, and above all, control. But beneath that polished exterior was a man whose deepest fear was not death, not Azkaban, and not even the Dark Lord himself. For Lucius Malfoy, the most terrifying vision his boggart could summon would be of himself, stripped of dignity, his wand broken, his status gone, exiled from the magical world, rejected by both ally and enemy alike. He would see himself standing outside the gates of the Ministry of Magic, gates that once opened before him without question, now closed and locked. His fine robes would be gone, replaced by tattered, unrecognizable garments, shame made cloth. His hair, once sleek and perfect, would be unkempt and falling across his face like a curtain of disgrace. Behind him, the wrought-iron gates of Malfoy Manor, his ancestral home, would swing shut forever. That was the vision that would paralyze Lucius, not the Dementors, not the wand of Harry Potter, not even the wrath of Voldemort, but a quiet, silent fall from grace. Throughout his life, Lucius curated an identity built entirely on perception. He never lifted his wand unless it served a purpose. Power to him was a chessboard, and he had always played with white pieces, believing the game was rigged in his favor. He maneuvered through the political shadows, donating to the ministry, sitting on boards at Hogwarts and whispering to influential ears. He had the uncanny ability to remain just close enough to the Death Eaters to be of use, but far enough to claim innocence when required. "You know, Minister, I wouldn't want to be thought of as anything but a concerned parent," he once told Cornelius Fudge, feigning innocence with a silk-laced smile. But power is a dangerous game to play in times of war. When Voldemort returned, Lucius no longer had the luxury of neutrality. He was pulled back into the circle of the Dark Lord, where old debts were called in and masks of civility were burned. He was no longer the well-dressed puppet master. He was now a pawn himself, forced to bend the knee to a master who cared nothing for bloodlines or prestige, only for loyalty and fear. His greatest fall came not from battle, but from failure. At the Department of Mysteries, when tasked with recovering the prophecy from Harry Potter, Lucius led a group of Death Eaters with the arrogance of someone who believed victory was inevitable. He underestimated Harry, underestimated Dumbledore's reach, and most fatally, underestimated the cost of losing. When the prophecy shattered, so did Lucius's standing. Voldemort's fury was swift, and Lucius was cast aside like a broken piece on the board. He was imprisoned in Azkaban, a place that eroded more than physical strength. It stripped men like Lucius of illusions. The damp stone walls did not recognize old money, did not respond to the name Malfoy. His pride, which once stood taller than the manor itself, crumbled in the silence of those dark cells. Narcissa visited him, not as the wife of a powerful man, but as a woman pleading for scraps of dignity left in the ruins of their legacy. Their son, Draco, was pulled deeper into the darkness as his father lay shackled in disgrace. The true agony for Lucius wasn't physical. It was the knowledge that his carefully built world had cracked, that whispers of his name no longer inspired respect, but scorn. He had wanted to be remembered as a guardian of heritage, a protector of the old ways. But in the new whispers, Lucius Malfoy was now a failure, a man who couldn't even deliver a prophecy, a man who sent his only son into danger to reclaim his favor. In the Second Wizarding War, he was no longer feared. He was pitied. Voldemort's return to Malfoy Manor was perhaps the most symbolic desecration of Lucius's power. The drawing room, once a sanctuary of aristocratic decorum, became a chamber of horror. The long dining table became a place where Death Eaters gathered not for strategy, but for punishment. Voldemort took Lucius's wand, an intimate violation of magical identity. The wand that had once sealed his image as a dominant wizard was now in the hand of a creature who saw no value in honor, only in utility. "Your wand, Lucius. I require your wand." He gave it up without resistance. That single act, though quiet, was thunderous in its symbolism. Lucius was no longer in control of his name, his house, or even his magic. He sat silently at meetings in his own home while Voldemort killed from his chair. When Charity Burbage was murdered over their dinner table, Lucius didn't protest. He couldn't. He was not a host, he was a hostage. This version of Lucius, the broken patriarch watching his family spiral, was the one his Boggart would bring to life. Narcissa's eyes, full of disappointment she never voiced. Draco's haunted expression as he stumbled through his assignments for Voldemort, his soul scraped raw by the burden of expectations and fear. And Lucius himself, unable to undo what he had done, unable to stop the world he tried to control from collapsing around him. For a man like Lucius, this wasn't just a loss of power, it was a spiritual death. His belief in the sanctity of blood and the righteousness of their family name became ash. He began to understand the cost of arrogance, not in political terms, but in human ones. He saw it in Draco's trembling hands, in Narcissa's quiet rage. He saw it in the eyes of those who used to greet him with bows and now turned away in disgust. By the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, Lucius was unrecognizable, not in body, but in will. He no longer stood at the center of dark councils. He didn't fight for Voldemort. He didn't fight at all. He and his wife chose instead to search for their son. For the first time, Lucius abandoned the battlefield in favor of something deeper than blood purity: family. "Come back," Narcissa whispered, and Lucius followed. It was not courage, it was desperation, but in that moment it was also the first real act of love he had shown in years. After the war, Lucius Malfoy was not imprisoned again. He was not tried as other Death Eaters were. Perhaps it was his silence, perhaps his lack of resistance in the final hours, or perhaps the influence of those who still feared what the Malfoy name could stir. But freedom did not mean redemption. The gates of the ministry would never open for him again. His face would never return to the front pages in admiration. He would walk through Diagon Alley not as a nobleman, but as a relic of a bygone era. And so the Boggart remains, not a creature with fangs or fire, not a ghost or a death omen, but a vision. Lucius Malfoy, in torn robes, his cane broken, his wand shattered, standing at the steps of his manor with the doors closed. No house elf to greet him, no owl to deliver invitations, just silence and the knowledge that no one inside cares he is out there. A man forgotten. This Boggart does not roar, it does not scream. It merely stares with Lucius's own eyes, eyes that once gazed down upon others, now searching for someone to look up to him again. But no one will. That is his punishment. That is his greatest fear. To fall and have no one notice, to beg for return and find no answer, to live in a world that has moved on and taken his legacy with it. When asked what he feared, Lucius might have once said losing power, but now if truth were demanded, the answer would be simpler. He feared becoming invisible. And perhaps, in the end, he did. Number 25, James Potter, lifeless Lily, and Harry in Voldemort's hands. James Potter never faced a Boggart in the books, but it takes little effort to imagine what form it would have taken. Unlike Neville's fear of Professor Snape or Ron's terror of spiders, James's Boggart would have been more visceral, more personal, and far more devastating. It wouldn't have been a creature or a phobia, but a scene, a twisted portrait of helplessness. The crumpled body of Lily, her fiery hair stained with blood, and the tiny frame of baby Harry, limp and lifeless, held casually in the cold, pale hands of Lord Voldemort. It's not the grotesqueness of death that James would have feared, but its meaning, the failure to protect those he loved more than anything in the world. James Potter grew up privileged and powerful, with a wand that rarely missed, and confidence that often teetered on arrogance. At Hogwarts he was known for his mischief, his charm, and his undeniable talent. Alongside Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew, he was the heart of the marauders, a whirlwind of pranks and laughter that filled the halls of the castle. But for all the bravado, James was never tested by true fear, not until Lily Evans and not until Harry. The transformation from boy to father was quiet, invisible almost, but absolute. Gone were the days of reckless Quidditch dives and midnight duels in the corridors. In their place came the sound of tiny footsteps, late-night cries, and the soft rhythm of Lily's breathing beside him. When Harry was born, something in James shifted. He had always been brave, but now he had something to lose. And when a man has something to lose, courage is no longer just a trait, it becomes a mission. There was a war raging outside, but within the walls of their cottage in Godric's Hollow, James had carved out a sliver of peace. Every morning he would watch Lily hold Harry by the window, sunlight catching her hair and wrapping their son in warmth. These were moments that Voldemort could never understand, ordinary, mundane, sacred. And James feared nothing more than the idea that these moments could be stolen, shattered in an instant by the flick of a wand. When Voldemort came to their home on that October night, James did not hesitate. He was unarmed, caught off guard, but none of that mattered. His fear was not of death, his fear was being too late. He ran, not to fight for his life, but to buy Lily time, to give Harry even one more heartbeat. That kind of fear cannot be explained away with logic or bravado. It's primal, consuming. It's what makes the image of a boggart taking the form of his wife and son in Voldemort's grasp so tragically believable. "Stand aside, you silly girl. Stand aside now," Voldemort had said, according to the memory shared by Snape in Deathly Hallows. But James never got even that warning. He was struck down without mercy. The Dark Lord didn't see him as a threat. That, perhaps, was the most painful insult. James died without his wand, but not without purpose. His death was not noble in the way the wizarding world defines it. It was desperate, instinctual, but that is precisely what makes it powerful. The notion that James's greatest fear was not his own death, but the death of those he loved, places him among the rarest breed of wizards, those who fear not pain nor defeat, but failure. Failure to protect, failure to save. James had been many things in his youth, a prankster, a bully even, but fatherhood stripped away the layers and left behind the raw core of a protector. And for him, the ultimate horror was not Voldemort's power, but Voldemort's success. Imagine the form of that boggart, the room gone silent as it shifts before his eyes. Not a Dementor, not fire or blood, but the still silence of Lily's body slumped on the floor, and Harry's head resting unnaturally to one side, and Voldemort smiling. The fear is not loud, it is deafeningly quiet, no scream, no echo, just the sound of everything ending. It is easy to romanticize James's final moments, to envision them as a heroic standoff, but truthfully they were more heartbreaking than glorious. He didn't have time to cast a spell, he didn't even have time to reach for his wand, and yet he stood his ground. That's the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines but leaves a scar in the hearts of those who remember. There's a cruel irony in the fact that James's sacrifice bought only seconds, but those seconds allowed Lily to make her choice, to die for Harry, and that in turn gave rise to the magic that Voldemort could not defeat. The curse rebounded upon him, and Harry lived, Dumbledore explained. But it all started with James. His death was not the end. It was the beginning of something greater. James Potter never lived to see Harry grow up, never saw him mount a broomstick, or choose Gryffindor, or face Voldemort with the same defiance burning in his green eyes. But had he faced a boggart, he would have seen the culmination of all those moments stolen from him. The lost birthdays, the bedtime stories unsaid, the future unravelled. That's what the boggart would have shown. Not just death, but absence. And unlike Harry, who learned to vanquish his boggart by imagining laughter and silliness, James could not have laughed this one away. How does one transform the sight of one's family murdered into something ridiculous? How does one wrap that kind of grief in comedy? Some fears are too sacred for jest. Sirius Black once said that James would have died for any of them, and he did, but it wasn't for the order or the cause. It was for Lily, for Harry, for love. That's the kind of fear that leaves a man willing to face the worst without armor. And it's the kind of fear that speaks volumes when unspoken. In the mirror of Erised, Harry saw his parents, whole, alive, together. One wonders what James would have seen, not glory, not victory. Likely just Harry, safe in Lily's arms. Maybe that same quiet scene from Godric's Hollow, but in reverse, this time Voldemort never comes. This time the door never bursts open. That would be his deepest desire. And it's in that desire that his deepest fear is also buried. We often remember James as the boy who bullied Snape, the star chaser with wind-blown hair and a mischievous grin. But his story, his true story, is written in sacrifice. It is written in the decision to run toward danger without a wand, because love outweighed fear. Because his son's heartbeat mattered more than his own. Lily's fear might have taken the form of Harry in pain, and Harry's fear became Dementors, the very embodiment of his trauma. But James's boggart would not have attacked. It would have stood there, silent, triumphant in its stillness. Voldemort would have been the background. The real horror was Harry's small hand, hanging limp, Lily's head turned away, and James watching. Too late, too slow. And what would have happened in a classroom had James faced that boggart? Would he have collapsed? Would he have stood frozen, unable to move? Or perhaps like Molly Weasley when she faced her boggart, her children dead before her eyes, James would have fought back tears and rage, even knowing that laughter could never conquer such a vision. There is something unbearably human in the idea that James Potter feared not death, but powerlessness, not his own destruction, but his inability to prevent that of others. That's the mark of a true Gryffindor, not blind bravery, but fear that is understood and faced anyway. No amount of training at Hogwarts could have prepared him for that night. No prank, no duel, no Quidditch victory could have made the loss easier. But he still chose to act. In those final seconds, he did not run, did not hide. He did not beg, he stood. James Potter's boggart would have been the ultimate mirror, reflecting not a monster, but a memory that never came to pass, and yet defined his entire legacy. It would be a snapshot of what he failed to stop, a moment frozen forever in the minds of those left behind, and that is why he never needed to face it. He lived it. On Halloween night, 1981, James Potter met his boggart face to face and walked straight into it, unarmed, unflinching, and unforgotten. Number 26, Narcissa Malfoy, Draco's dead body. There are fears that twist the soul, fears not born of darkness but of love so deep it becomes a terrifying vulnerability. For Narcissa Malfoy, the fear that shaped her very being was not of death, disgrace, or the Dark Lord's wrath. It was the image of her son, Draco, lifeless on the cold, unforgiving floor of Hogwarts. That would be her boggart emerging from a cracked wardrobe in a dim room. Not a grotesque monster, but the body of her only child, pale and still, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing. The terror of loss, not power, not shame, defined her. And this fear, quietly buried beneath her composed exterior, was what made her both dangerous and profoundly human. Unlike her husband Lucius, whose loyalties to Voldemort were entangled with ambition, fear, and ideology, Narcissa had only one compass: Draco. The war was not her battlefield, politics were not her passion, blood purity was never her doctrine. She operated not from fanaticism, but from the instinctual, unshakable devotion of a mother. It was that love which ultimately shaped her actions and led her to commit the most daring act of defiance against the Dark Lord himself. When the tide of war turned, when the walls of Malfoy Manor echoed with screams and desperation, Narcissa's resolve hardened. She stood in the shadows of monsters, walked among the damned, and survived not because she believed in their cause, but because she had to keep her son alive. She was not a Death Eater, though she bore the title by marriage. She was a mother behind enemy lines, maneuvering through a nightmare she could not escape, pretending loyalty to a man who would not hesitate to kill her family for failure. That fear, the fear of Draco's death, was made manifest during the Battle of Hogwarts. As the final stand unfolded in the shattered halls of the castle, The bodies piled high, and uncertainty clouded every breath. Narcissa, amidst the chaos, did not seek victory for Voldemort, nor revenge, nor glory. Her eyes searched only for her son. Every spell that burst, every scream that echoed, was a question. Is Draco still alive? And then came the moment that immortalized her name. Harry Potter, limp in Hagrid's arms, presumed dead, was presented to the defenders of Hogwarts as a symbol of their defeat. Voldemort, eyes alight with triumph, demanded validation of his supposed victory. He chose Narcissa to inspect the boy. The task was simple: check for signs of life, confirm the corpse, and seal the fate of the wizarding world. But Narcissa knelt, leaned in, and whispered the only question that mattered to her. "Is Draco alive?" Harry whispered back. "Yes, he is." That single moment, barely a breath in time, defined her forever. She turned to Voldemort, to death incarnate, and lied. "He is dead." With those 3 words, she betrayed the Dark Lord. Not for Potter, not for the Order, not even for a hope of redemption. She lied for her son. It was a moment as powerful as any duel. In that breathless heartbeat, Narcissa Malfoy did what few dared to do. She outwitted Voldemort. She stared into the abyss and blinked first, but she blinked strategically, purposefully, and with the most profound courage. The lie she told wasn't just survival. It was love, weaponized. It was a mother turning her worst fear into action. Had she opened a wardrobe and seen her boggart, it would not have been an abstract horror. It would have been Draco, sprawled at the foot of the marble staircase in Hogwarts, face frozen in a final expression of fear, or worse, of peace. Narcissa's imagination would paint every detail: the Slytherin robes stained with blood, his wand broken beside him, his pale hair darkened by dust and ash. A boy who had been forced to grow too fast, who had carried the weight of a cursed task, now reduced to silence. That image would not only be her greatest fear, it would be her destruction. We often imagine boggarts as symbols of individual phobias, spiders, heights, the undead. But for Narcissa, the boggart wasn't about her. It was about the one life that made hers meaningful. In her world, losing Draco wasn't just tragic. It was apocalyptic. Without him, she had no cause, no center, no reason to exist. This fear was deeper than ideology. It surpassed all bloodlines and legacies. Narcissa's loyalty had always been suspect to those who truly paid attention. When Bellatrix Lestrange, her sister, mocked her for seeking Severus Snape's help to protect Draco, Narcissa replied, not with arrogance, but with desperation. She knelt, she pleaded, she invoked the unbreakable vow. Her actions made it clear she would sell her soul to protect her child. She would bind herself to someone she didn't fully trust. That act alone showed the extent of her terror. She didn't believe in Voldemort's mercy. She didn't believe in Lucius's influence. She trusted only herself, and Snape, to a degree, because Draco's life was slipping through her fingers. The tragedy of Narcissa Malfoy is not that she lived in darkness, it's that she had to perform it. Every polite dinner, every stoic appearance at the ministry, every careful word in front of Voldemort was a performance. Inside her, the fear was constant. Draco is not safe, and when your child is unsafe, nothing else matters. Not the manner, not the name, not the politics of magical blood, only survival, only escape. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when she walks through the Forbidden Forest with the victorious Death Eaters, she is no longer a character on the periphery. She becomes the hinge upon which the story turns. For all of Voldemort's power, for all of Dumbledore's planning, for all of Harry's sacrifice, it is Narcissa's lie that allows the final battle to happen. She is the mother who bought the last breath of hope with the currency of betrayal. Imagine that moment again. Voldemort watches her. Bellatrix waits behind him, wand ready, suspicion thinly veiled. The Death Eaters crowd around, drunk on the scent of victory. And Narcissa must make a decision. Her hand touches Harry's chest. She feels the faint warmth, hears the whisper. She realizes Draco is alive, but only if she lives to find him, only if she plays her part. So she stands, looks into the eyes of the monster who once cradled her hand in false affection, and lies. She is brave, someone might say. No, she is terrified, but she is a mother, and for a mother like Narcissa, fear is not paralysis. It is movement, it is motive, it is strategy. She does not scream, she does not fight. She simply lies, and that lie changes everything. In the aftermath of the war, we see little of Narcissa. She does not demand praise. She does not boast of her part. She returns to Malfoy Manor, to the remnants of a fractured world. But she has what she came for. Draco, alive. That is enough. That was always enough. Her story ends not with glory, but with quiet survival. And in a world so defined by noise that silence speaks volumes, one cannot ignore the juxtaposition between her and Bellatrix. Bellatrix, mad with loyalty, lived for Voldemort and died by her wand. Narcissa, calm and composed, lived for her son and survived by her lie. Where Bellatrix was a fanatic, Narcissa was a strategist. Where Bellatrix laughed, Narcissa calculated. In the end, only one of them walked away. The Boggart theory tells us more about Narcissa than any scene in the books. If her deepest fear is Draco's corpse, then every act of treason, every moment of deception, every cold glance and formal nod was fueled by a nightmare that never stopped haunting her. She never wanted power, she wanted peace, not for herself, but for Draco. The idea of seeing him dead, especially in a place like Hogwarts, a school meant to be safe, was a horror she could not survive. That is why her Boggart would choose that setting. The image of betrayal, Hogwarts, the promise of education and friendship, stained with blood. A mother's grief painted across its marble floors. Perhaps that is the tragedy of Narcissa Malfoy. In a world where people chose sides, she chose a person. In a war between good and evil, she picked love. And in a universe filled with magic, curses, and immortality, her greatest act was entirely human. She protected her child with a lie. J.K. Rowling herself once said that Narcissa is not a Death Eater. She is a woman who was forced to make terrible choices to protect her son. This quote, though not in the books, aligns perfectly with what we witness in the text. Narcissa was never about cruelty. She was about consequence and fear and love. If ever there was a Boggart that could bring even the bravest Auror to tears, it would be hers. A boy fallen, a future erased, a mother broken. No wand could banish that image. Not truly, not permanently. It would haunt her forever. Because for Narcissa, the nightmare wasn't just a possibility. It was always one decision away. So when you think of the bravest in the wizarding world, don't forget the quiet ones. The ones who didn't fight with spells, but with lies. The ones who didn't chase glory, but clung to love. Narcissa Malfoy's Boggart tells the whole story in a single, terrible image. And in that image lies the truth. Love, not ideology, is what shapes us. And sometimes it's love, not magic, that saves the world. Number 27, Fleur Delacour, Bill telling her she ruined his life. In the flickering candlelight of Shell Cottage, Fleur Delacour sat silently by the window, her hand resting gently on the scarred one of her husband. The sea outside whispered in the hush of night, but inside her heart storms raged. She had chosen this path, had vowed herself to Bill Weasley long before the fangs of Fenrir Greyback tore through his flesh. And when others questioned her choice, when even Molly Weasley looked on with quiet uncertainty, Fleur's resolve was made of something fiercer than pride. It was love, but not the fragile, idealized kind that shatters at the first sign of hardship. Fleur's love was steely, forged in loyalty and trial. Still, buried deep within her soul, lingered a fear so intimate it could only take shape in the form of a Boggart. Fleur Delacour was part Vila, and much had been assumed about her because of it. Beauty, allure, and charm followed her name, but few ever looked beyond. Yet after the battle of the Astronomy Tower, when Bill was attacked, and his once handsome face disfigured by Greyback's feral rage, Fleur's first response was neither horror nor hesitation. She said, with fire in her voice and steel in her spine, "What do I care how he looks? I'm good-looking enough for both of us, I think." That line, defiant and proud, was remembered by those who heard it, but it was what she did afterwards, staying, healing, loving, that defined her. Still, love cannot entirely erase fear. For Fleur, it wasn't the scars or the changed life that haunted her. It was the question that gnawed at her in the silent moments, the idea that her presence, her choices, her very love might one day cause pain to the man she had promised to cherish. If a boggart had crawled from the shadows before her, it would not be a werewolf nor her own ruined reflection, but Bill, her Bill, with sorrow in his eyes and a voice heavy with heartbreak, whispering, "You ruined my life." Not in anger, in despair. That Fleur could not bear. Fleur had grown up in a world where elegance and perfection were expected. From Beauxbatons to the Triwizard Tournament, she carried herself with poise, even when mocked or misunderstood. She was the only female champion, and despite moments of fear and misjudgment, she faced every trial. Yet none of those challenges prepared her for the intimacy of a shared life marred by pain and recovery. The burden of being someone's comfort, someone's strength, terrified her far more than dragons or mazes ever did. Bill's recovery was slow, the scars didn't fade, and neither did the pain. Some nights he would wake from nightmares, sweating, trembling, and Fleur would be there, whispering in French, holding him until his breathing softened. These were the nights when the fear crept into her bones. What if he wished for another life, a wife unshaken by horror, a future untouched by violence? Fleur's nightmare wasn't about abandonment. It was about failing someone she had vowed to protect with her heart. After their wedding, they moved to Shell Cottage, a place both beautiful and remote. It became a refuge, but also a crucible. Fleur tended to the wounded, offered her home as a sanctuary, and stood as a guardian during the darkest hours of the war. There was no glamour in those days, no silk gowns or polished grace. She wore aprons stained with potions, and her hands were rough from work. Yet she never once hesitated. Love, in its truest form, requires action more than affection. She proved herself not with grand gestures, but in quiet resilience. The boggart in Fleur's mind was not a projection of her ego or fears of imperfection. It was a whisper of doubt, an echo of every moment she saw pain flicker across Bill's face. It was born not from vanity, but from devotion. This phantom Bill, the one from her deepest fear, didn't blame her in fury. He simply looked broken, disappointed. "You couldn't save me," his imagined voice might say. And that Fleur could not forgive herself for, even if he never uttered such a thing in real life. In many ways, Fleur's strength was misunderstood by those around her. Molly Weasley, in particular, doubted her depth early on. She mistook Fleur's elegance for shallowness, her beauty for superficiality. But Fleur was a woman of fire and will. Her decision to marry Bill didn't stem from naive romance. It came from a clarity of purpose. Even during the dark days after Bill's attack, she never wavered. If anything, her resolve deepened. There's an undeniable beauty in the way Fleur allowed her fear to guide her into strength. Rather than succumb to it, she let it shape her empathy. She learned how to brew healing draughts, how to mend broken bones and reassure wounded souls. She comforted Ollivander, fed the escaped Griphook, and tended to the battered trio who arrived at her doorstep after escaping Malfoy Manor. She turned her home into a haven, even as her heart quietly bled with silent fears. The boggart she would face, that phantom Bill filled with disappointment, was not just an expression of her fear, it was an expression of her conscience. It reminded her of the weight of love, the responsibility that comes with choosing to stand beside someone in suffering. Unlike others whose boggarts might have been fearsome beasts or death itself, Fleur's was intimate, emotional, human. What made this fear so poignant was how rarely it was spoken of. Fleur never voiced these doubts aloud. She never shared them with Bill, nor with Molly, nor even with her sister Gabrielle. And yet they lived in her, silent passengers in her quiet moments. When Bill smiled through his pain or chuckled while reading the Daily Prophet, Fleur would sometimes pause, watching, hoping that behind his grin there wasn't a hidden wince, that he didn't resent the path his life had taken. The Boggart reminded Fleur not only of what she feared, but what she valued most: Bill's heart, his spirit, and the joy they had vowed to preserve. It was not fear of losing love, but of becoming the reason for its demise. That was her terror, that despite her best intentions, her unwavering devotion, she might somehow fall short. After the birth of their daughter Victoire, Fleur's quiet dread did not vanish, but it softened. Watching Bill hold their child, his smile genuine, something within her began to heal. Still, she sometimes wondered, what would the Boggart show her now? Would it still be Bill, but older, perhaps more tired, whispering that she had failed him somehow? Or would it be her daughter, echoing the same quiet heartbreak? Fleur never allowed herself to grow too comfortable in the illusion of security. The legacy of Fleur's fear and her courage offers something rarely explored in tales of magic and war. It shows the aftermath, the emotional terrain heroes must walk when the battles are over. Fleur was never just a bride, a beauty, or a supporting character. She was a warrior in her own right, a healer, a shield. And her Boggart did not diminish her, it revealed the depth of her humanity. The haunting image of Bill, altered not by scars but by sorrow, was a mirror of Fleur's inner world. In facing that phantom, Fleur stood against the darkest part of herself, the belief that love may not be enough. But each day she chose to stay, to nurture, to listen, and to love again. She defied that fear. That's what made her strong. That's what made her real. It is easy to think of bravery as sword-swinging and spell-casting. But Fleur's bravery was quieter. She didn't duel Death Eaters in every scene, but she stood every day against her own doubt. And that takes more strength than most know. She did not slay dragons, but she tended to those burned by them. She did not command armies, but she commanded grace in chaos. J.K. Rowling never showed us Fleur facing a Boggart, but if she had, the vision would have been powerful, not because it was frightening in a traditional sense, but because it would have revealed her soul's greatest weight. It wouldn't be fire, fangs, or death. It would be the silent heartbreak of a man she loved, believing, if only for a moment, that his pain began with her. And yet Fleur would stand, wand raised, voice unwavering. She would shout the counterspell with every ounce of love in her. "Ridiculous!" she'd cry, and the phantom Bill might burst into a lopsided grin, his scar shimmering like a badge, not a burden. He might start dancing ridiculously in a velvet beret or singing off-key in French, because even Fleur's greatest fear could be met with laughter. Once it was brought into the light. Fleur Delacour, the champion of Beauxbatons, the wife of a wounded warrior, the mother of hope, bore within her the quiet dignity of those who love deeply and fear silently. Her imagined Boggart didn't make her weak, it made her noble, because to fear hurting the one you love is not a flaw. It is proof that your heart beats not just for yourself, but for another. And in the world of magic, that is the greatest spell of all. Number 28, Severus Snape, Lily's corpse, and his own dark mark. In the quiet, shadowed corridors of Hogwarts, few figures evoke as much mystery and contradiction as Severus Snape. His presence is often described as an oily silhouette in a billowing black robe, a man whose eyes carry more history than most are willing to know. But within that sallow exterior lies a depth of pain rarely glimpsed even by those closest to him. If Severus Snape were to face a Boggart, alone, with no audience and no facade, the spectre it would take would not be a monstrous creature or a fearsome spell. It would be far more intimate and infinitely more devastating. The Boggart would shift and twist into the image of Lily Potter's lifeless body, her red hair splayed across the ground, her eyes closed in eternal rest, her face pale and serene in the most tragic way. But it would not end there. Beside her, knees sunk into the cold floor, would be Severus himself. Not as the younger boy who cried out in panic upon discovering her death, but as the man he became, his dark mark blazing violently on his forearm. This vision would not be fear alone, it would be the distilled essence of guilt. Snape's greatest terror was not being killed by Voldemort, nor even being exposed by Dumbledore's intricate double-agent game. It was the overwhelming horror that he was, in the end, responsible for Lily's death. Her end was a direct line from his own actions, from the whispered prophecy he delivered to the Dark Lord. Even though he did not mean for her to die, even though he begged Voldemort to spare her, the result was the same. Her blood, in his mind, had stained his hands forever. The boggart, ruthless in its mimicry, would embody that unbearable truth. The image is cruel in its precision. The woman he loved, lifeless by his own chain of decisions. The mark, a symbol of allegiance he spent a lifetime trying to sever, still binding him in death as in life. His fear was not punishment, it was consequence. Not of what others would do to him, but of what he had already done. This torment was not conjured by dementors, nor enforced by curses. It was internal. It followed him like a second shadow. He could not hide from it. Snape's bitterness and acerbic sarcasm, his calculated cruelty in the classroom, his public disdain for Harry. These were not the behaviours of a man without conscience. They were the shields of someone who could not bear his own reflection. Each insult, each moment of detached instruction, was a defence against unravelling in front of those who did not deserve to see his weakness. And yet, in private moments, especially after Sirius's death and the war escalated again, Snape's silence became almost unbearable, as if the quiet rooms of Spinner's End or the stone dungeons of Hogwarts whispered the name he could never say aloud without mourning. In The Prince's Tale, when Harry peers into Snape's memories, the truth becomes undeniable. Snape's heartbreak is not an abstract tragedy, it is real, visceral. Always, he says, in a moment that redefines his character entirely. He did not move on, he did not forgive himself. He lived each day not to redeem himself in others' eyes, but to fulfill a promise made to a dead woman, a promise that cost him everything. Snape's boggart scene would not involve screams or motion. It would be silent, still a tableau that would never change. That was the point. In that fixed image he is powerless. He cannot wake her. He cannot undo the brand on his arm. He cannot rewrite time. It is the essence of helplessness, and it gnaws at him like a curse with no counterspell. His greatest fear was not death, it was permanence. The permanence of loss, of mistake, of betrayal. We must understand, too, that Snape's reaction to the boggart would not be outwardly explosive. He would not yell or attack it with fury. He would freeze. That's the true cost of this particular fear. It paralyzes. And though Snape is a master of occlumency and self-control, even the most fortified walls tremble when the earthquake is personal. He might lift his wand to cast the ridiculous spell, but what humour can be found in your own soul laid bare? The dark mark itself, glowing in the vision, is more than just a physical identifier. It is symbolic of his worst choice, the moment he chose power over morality, the moment he decided knowledge and recognition mattered more than people. That single choice haunts him more than anything Voldemort ever did. In the image conjured by the boggart, the mark gleams brighter than ever, as if to say, this is who you really are. No matter what Dumbledore believes, no matter what you've done since, this is your truth. Snape lived with that contradiction daily. To the students he was a tyrant, to the Order a reluctant ally, to the Death Eaters a spy they never trusted. But to himself he was none of these. He was the man who got her killed. And the boggart would confirm what he already feared every night as he drifted to sleep. There is no forgiveness that matters when you cannot forgive yourself. Even his protective treatment of Harry is coloured by this grief. It is not affection, that drives him to safeguard the boy. It is obligation. Because Harry is a living reminder of Lily, yes, but also of Snape's own failure. He sees James in the boy's face and Lily in his eyes. Protecting Harry is not noble for Snape, it is penance, as if every time he saves Harry from harm, he is trying to rewrite that final chapter in Lily's story.
As if one day the boggart will show her alive. But it never does. The boggart is honest, and the boggart is cruel. It will always show Lily's death. It will always show Snape with the mark. In contrast to Remus Lupin, whose boggart became the full moon, a representation of what he is, Snape's boggart represents what he did. That distinction is critical. Lupin fears becoming dangerous to others. Snape fears he already has. That one difference separates remorse from dread. Lupin dreads the future. Snape dreads the past. And that's why Snape's boggart would be more torturous. You can prepare for a future danger. You cannot undo a past sin. During the occlumency lessons with Harry, Snape demands control. He rails against weakness, but beneath the fury is desperation. If Harry ever glimpsed what Snape's boggart would reveal, he might begin to understand why Snape is so harsh, so guarded. Why he cannot tolerate Harry's recklessness, because recklessness took Lily from him. And Harry's every defiance is like a whisper from the past. You couldn't stop it before. You can't stop it now. When Snape kills Dumbledore, he becomes the embodiment of betrayal to all who watch. But even in that moment, he acts under orders. He acts to preserve the mission, the protection of Draco, and ultimately, Harry. He becomes what he fears most, a traitor so that others can be saved. The Boggarts' prophecy becomes self-fulfilling. Snape relives it over and over, doing terrible things so that just maybe he might do one good thing in the end. It is fitting, then, that Snape dies alone. His life, always shrouded in secrecy and sacrifice, ends with one final revelation. Harry sees the truth in his memories, but Snape never knows if anyone understood him. That uncertainty lingers like the shadow of the boggart. Was it worth it? Did he matter beyond his guilt? His life was shaped not by ambition, but by aftermath. After Lily's death, after the prophecy, after his vow, every step forward was in reaction to a step back. That is the tragedy of Snape. Not that he loved and lost, but that he never stopped mourning. If you imagine him standing in a room with a boggart now, it would still be Lily's body. The mark still burns. Even after death, even after all he's done. Because forgiveness was never his goal. Memory was, and memory, unlike magic, cannot be changed. His was a life of silence, pain wrapped in silence, love buried beneath anger. The boggart did not just show his fear, it showed his soul, and perhaps that is why he never faced it publicly. Because the moment that image appeared, Severus Snape would no longer be the feared professor, the cold-eyed spy, or even the misunderstood hero. He would be what he always was, a broken man standing over the only person he ever loved, marked forever by the moment he lost her. Number 29. Gilderoy Lockhart, himself forgotten and ignored. Gilderoy Lockhart was never truly afraid of death. Pain, injury, or the shadows that scared others meant little to him. What haunted his dreams was far more chilling, a vision of himself, unrecognized, forgotten, anonymous. A man who built an entire identity upon admiration, applause, and fabricated fame would find his worst terror not in monsters or curses, but in silence, in indifference,
in being invisible in the eyes of others. If a boggart had ever leapt from the darkness to reveal his inner fear, it wouldn't have transformed into a vampire or a dementor. It would have become Gilderoy himself, older, faded, walking past fans who no longer remembered his name, a version of him stripped of illusions, ignored by the world he once dazzled. He lived for the sparkle of his own smile on the front page of the Daily Prophet, for the crowds that screamed at his book signings, for the gasps of witches and wizards who believed every tale he spun. Lockhart's fear wasn't rooted in truth, it was rooted in irrelevance. "Fame is a fickle friend, Harry," he once said, although he was hardly being honest in that moment. For Lockhart, fame was not a friend. It was a god to be worshipped, a prize worth any deception. And he lied with skill, stealing stories from brave witches and wizards and claiming their victories as his own. He did not simply forge a name, he erased others to elevate himself. There was the tale of the Bandon Banshee, which he defeated with a simple little charm. In truth, it was a clever and resourceful witch from Belfast named Miranda Goshawk who had outwitted the creature with a mirrored curse. Lockhart simply tracked her down, extracted the story, and then used a memory charm to erase her recollection of the event and of him. She had no idea what she had accomplished, he boasted in Magical Me, his best-selling autobiography. But she did, until he stole it from her. The fear of being forgotten stalked him like a silent hunter. Lockhart could not allow others to shine, for their light threatened to eclipse his own. That's why, even as a Hogwarts professor, he insisted on leading every class with a theatrical performance of his own exploits. Whether the subject was Cornish pixies or the Yeti of Tibet, the centre of attention was always Lockhart. It was never about education, it was about preservation of his image, of his myth, of his name. But mythologies built on lies are fragile, and Lockhart's greatest irony, his poetic punishment, was to suffer the fate he feared most. During the incident in the Chamber of Secrets, he tried once again to erase someone else's memory. This time it was Harry Potter and Ron Weasley. He grabbed Ron's broken wand and aimed the Obliviate spell with his usual flair. But the wand backfired, and the spell struck the caster instead. Gilderoy Lockhart, master of lies, master of self-promotion, lost everything he truly cared about. Not his life, not his safety, his identity.